Section 1. The nature of the unsolved. There is a particular kind of story that never really ends. Not because the writers ran out of ideas and not because the show was canceled before anyone could explain things, but because the answer was deliberately left out. A door that was built without a handle. A question asked into a room full of people who all look somewhere else the moment it lands. Family Guy has been doing this since the 31st of January, 1999. For more than 25 years, it has been slipping things into its own mythology. Small mysteries buried beneath the cutaway gags and the loud jokes and the general organized chaos of a show that rarely seemed to take itself seriously. And then it would move forward. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a door left open in the dark, cold air coming through from the other side. That is what we are here for tonight. This is going to be a long journey, a slow one through the strangest and darkest corners of a show that most people believe they understand completely. You have probably watched Family Guy for years. You probably think of it as a comedy loud, irreverent, frequently offensive, occasionally brilliant, always willing to push one more button than seems strictly necessary. And you are not wrong. That is exactly what it is, most of the time. But underneath that surface, underneath the cutaways and the enormous chicken fights and the Conway Twitty songs and Peter's high-pitched laugh underneath all of that, there is a whole layer of lore that the show almost never addresses. Directly. Questions that got asked once and never answered again. Characters whose backstories contain things that should have been followed up on across the following seasons but simply were not. Episodes that planted seeds the show chose not to water. Mysteries that have been sitting in the dark for decades, waiting for someone to sit down and actually look at them. Some of these are genuinely disturbing when you spend enough time with them. Not disturbing in the way Family Guy usually does disturbing, which is loud and brightly colored and accompanied by a joke that announces its own offensiveness. This is a quieter kind of disturbing. The kind that accumulates in a room and does not go away when you turn the lights on. We are going to take them one at a time. Slowly. But first, some context. Because context is everything with mysteries, and Family Guy is not a show that makes context easy. The show was never designed to maintain tight continuity. Seth MacFarlane and the various writers who passed through the show across its run built it on a floating timeline, a storytelling approach where characters stay roughly the same age regardless of how many years pass in the real world, where events from previous episodes are sometimes remembered and sometimes not, depending entirely on what the current story needs, and where the fundamental rules of the universe bend constantly to accommodate whatever joke is being set up this week. This means that some of what we are going to discuss were probably never intended to be mysteries at all. A throwaway line that raised a genuinely interesting question was most likely just that, a throwaway line, written for a quick laugh in a writer's room and then forgotten by the following Monday. But the audience did not forget. Audiences of long-running shows develop a kind of institutional memory that no individual writer can match, and Family Guy has had 25 years of that memory accumulating. When you take all of the loose threads from this show, the unexplained origins, the unanswered questions, the contradictions between episodes, the things the characters know and will not say, and you lay them out in the same space, side by side, in the quiet, a picture starts to form. It is not the picture the show was advertising. It is something stranger and more uncomfortable than a comedy about a lovable idiot and his talking dog was supposed to produce. The Griffin family is, in many ways, a deeply damaged group of people. Peter is a man whose entire history is built on secrets about his parentage, about his name, about who raised him, and who his real father was. Lois is a woman carrying something she has never told her oldest daughter. Brian has a plan in a bank vault that tells you more about his interior life than anything he has said out loud in 25 seasons of carefully composed banter. Stewie exists in a state of fundamental paradox that the show introduced and then refused to examine. And Meg is at the center of a secret that everyone in her family knows except her, which may or may not explain everything about how they treat her. These are not small things, these are foundational things. And they are sitting in the mythology of a show that has aired more than 400 episodes, generated billions of dollars in revenue, and shaped the comedy landscape of an entire era of television. Tonight we are going to look at all of them. We are going to pull each door a little further open. We are going to sit with the cold air for a while, and we are going to start with the mystery that casts the longest shadow over everything else in the show. The secret at the center of the Griffin family that changes the meaning of virtually every scene Meg Griffin has ever been in. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. It genuinely means something to know someone is out there in the dark on the other end of this. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It is free, and it is the single best thing you can do to help this keep going. Section 2. The Shadow Father, who is Stan Thompson, and what does his existence mean? The moment it happens is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention. It is placed in the middle of an episode that is primarily about something else entirely, delivered at conversational speed in a scene full of other things happening, and then the show moves past it without pausing to let the weight of it land. It is Season 3, Episode 9. The episode is called Screwed the Pooch, and for most of its runtime, it is a story about Brian Griffin being taken to court after it is discovered that he mated with a racing greyhound owned by Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's formidable and often antagonistic father. The episode is broad and comedic and moves at the clip that early Family Guy always maintained, the kind of pacing that never lets a scene breathe long enough to become anything more than what it appears to be on the surface. In the middle of the episode, Peter is in court arguing that Brian should be allowed access to the puppies he fathered. His argument is essentially that Brian is more attentive and more genuinely knowledgeable about the Griffin children than Peter himself is. To prove this, Peter starts asking Brian a series of questions, the kind of questions that a devoted parent would know the answers to and an inattentive one would not. He asks what Chris's favorite ice cream flavor is. Brian answers correctly. He asks what Stewie's favorite bedtime story is. Brian answers correctly. And then, with exactly the same energy and pace as the previous questions, Peter says, "What is the name of Meg's real father?" And Brian answers without hesitation or drama or any indication that this is anything other than a mundane piece of trivia. Stan Thompson. Meg is in the room when this happens. She is sitting right there among the people gathered for this proceeding, physically present for a revelation about her own life that should by any reasonable measure have completely altered her understanding of herself and her family. But she is wearing headphones and listening to music, completely absent from the conversation happening 4 feet away from her. So the name falls into the room, acknowledged by everyone present, and the scene moves on. No dramatic beat, no lingering camera, no music. The episode continues to its next moment, as if the door that just swung open is someone else's problem. And then you realize the full shape of what just happened. Peter knows, Brian knows, the court knows, and based on subsequent references scattered across later seasons, a knowing comment here. A quick aside there, Lois knows, Chris knows, Stewie, the 1-year-old baby who cannot legally vote or drive, apparently knows. Every member of the Griffin household knows that Meg Griffin is not biologically Peter's daughter. Everyone except Meg herself. Think about that for a long moment. Really sit with it. The person in the Griffin family who has absorbed the most cruelty across the entire run of the show, who has been insulted, ignored, physically harassed, emotionally demolished by her father, her siblings, her mother, and by the town of Quahog at large. This person is doing all of that absorbing, carrying all of that pain, under the assumption that the man at the center of her suffering is actually her father. She is defending a relationship that is built on a foundation the show quietly revealed to be fraudulent in the 3rd season of a show that ran for 25. And everyone in that house is complicit in keeping that from her. The question this raises about Peter's behavior toward Meg is one the show has never answered directly, but it is the obvious one, sitting right there in the middle of the mythology. When Peter treats Meg with contempt, when he forgets she exists, when he insults her in ways that go well past the point of comedy, when the show depicts him actively wishing she were not part of his life, is some portion of that contempt rooted in the knowledge that she is not his? Is the man who cannot bring himself to genuinely love Meg partly unable to do so because on some level he knows she was not supposed to be his to raise? The show gestures at this without committing. In the Season 4 Episode 4 Father, there is a brief scene where Peter sits in quiet thought and imagines what would have happened if he had left Meg with Stan Thompson instead of raising her. The thought experiment does not go anywhere extended. It is a short, mostly comedic moment, but the fact that it is in the episode at all, the fact that Peter is actively imagining a version of events where Meg is not his daughter in the functional sense either, suggests that the Stan Thompson question lives somewhere in Peter's head long after the courtroom scene. That he has not forgotten what he knows. That he thinks about it sometimes in whatever way Peter Griffin thinks about things. There is also Lois's behavior toward Meg, which takes on a different texture once the Stan Thompson revelation is in the room. Lois is, at the start of the show, a warm and reasonably functional mother. She is patient with Peter's disasters and genuinely engaged with her children's lives. But as the show progresses, Lois's warmth toward Meg specifically begins to cool in ways that track roughly with the escalation of Peter's cruelty. She does not defend Meg. She does not push back against Peter's treatment of her. In the later seasons, she begins to participate in it. Is Lois's detachment from Meg partly about who Meg is, the living result of something Lois did at some point before or early in her marriage that she would rather not look at directly? Is Meg, every time Lois looks at her, a reminder of Stan Thompson? Does Lois's guilt about a secret she has kept for decades translate into a kind of emotional distance that she has never examined and the show has never forced her to? These are questions the show posed and then left completely unanswered. They are questions that would have required a different kind of storytelling, sustained, character-driven, willing to sit with discomfort for longer than an episode that Family Guy was never architecturally designed to provide. What do we actually know about Stan Thompson beyond the name? Almost nothing. We know the name. We know that at some point Lois had a relationship or an encounter with a man named Stan Thompson that produced a pregnancy. We know that this encounter predates, or may overlap with, the early days of her relationship with Peter. We know that Stan Thompson did not remain in the picture, and that Meg was raised by Peter, who knew she was not biologically his and chose to raise her anyway, or perhaps was presented with a situation he could not easily exit and made the best of it, depending on how charitable you want to be. We do not know what Stan Thompson looks like. We do not know whether he knows about Meg. We do not know whether he has thought about her, or looked for her, or deliberately stayed away. We do not know whether the secret was Lois's to keep alone or whether Peter knew from the beginning or discovered it later. We do not know how Chris and Stewie know. Was it a family secret that leaked? Something overheard? Something Brian let slip one evening when no one was being careful? These are enormous blanks in the backstory of a character who has been in every single season of a 25-year television series. The show did eventually attempt to address the Stan Thompson storyline in a more direct way in one of its later seasons. There is an episode in which Meg discovers the truth and sets out to find her biological father. The story is built around the road trip to locate him, the confrontation when she does, and the complicated emotional fallout of meeting a man who is both a stranger and, in some fundamental biological sense, the closest genetic relative she has in the world. The episode handles this with a mixture of comedy and sentiment that is characteristic of what Family Guy does when it attempts to be sincere. But even this attempt at resolution does not fully close the door, because the emotional weight of what the discovery should mean, years of absorbing cruelty from a family that was keeping this from her, the retroactive recontextualization of every moment of her suffering, the question of who she actually is and where she actually comes from, never gets the room it would need to land in a way that feels proportionate to what the secret actually is. The show moves through it and then moves past it. Meg learns. Meg meets Stan Thompson. The episode ends. The following episode, to a great extent, proceeds as if the revelation has been processed and filed away rather than lived with. This is one of the most consistent frustrations of the Meg storyline across the entire show, and the Stan Thompson mystery sits at the center of it. The show has the pieces of a genuinely compelling story. A young woman raised by a family that treated her with contempt, built on a foundation of deception, who has to reconstruct her sense of identity on the other side of a revelation that changes everything she thought she knew. That story could be extraordinary. The pieces are there. They have been there since Season 3, Episode 9. The show just never chose to tell it. And so Stan Thompson remains a mystery, a name in a courtroom, a door that swings open briefly, lets the cold air in, and then is left neither fully open nor fully closed, just slightly ajar. Enough to feel, but not enough to walk through. Meg Griffin has a biological father somewhere in the mythology of this show. He is an almost entirely absent presence in a story that is partly, in its best moments, about a young woman trying to understand why the world does not love her the way she deserves to be loved. The answer to that question begins with a name that everyone in her family knows and no one has told her. Stan Thompson. Say it quietly. It is the kind of name that deserves to be said quietly. And then let the silence that follows it do what silence always does with the things we leave unsaid. Section 3. The Stewie Paradox. The identity of the most unusual being in the show. If you ask someone who has never watched Family Guy to describe Stewie Griffin, they will say something like, the evil baby. The 1-year-old who speaks with a British accent and wants to take over the world. And this description is correct for the first 3 seasons of the show, correct and also wildly insufficient, because it does not capture what made the original Stewie Griffin so genuinely extraordinary as a character. Let us build the picture properly. In the first season of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin is introduced as a baby who is also, simultaneously and without apology, a supervillain. This is not a quirk, and it is not a joke that gets deployed occasionally for variety. It is his entire identity and the organizing principle of his existence. Nearly every scene Stewie appears in during Season 1 involves him either operating a piece of advanced technology he has built himself, executing some phase of an ongoing plan for world domination, or actively working on the problem of how to kill his mother Lois. The inventory of his early season creations is genuinely staggering when you list them out. He built a time machine in the first season during the episode Mind Over Murder, using it not for global conquest, but to skip past the pain of teething, which is a perfect early Stewie moment, because it reveals that even his most extraordinary capabilities get deployed for the most immediate and practical purposes. He constructed a laser gun disguised as a sandwich. He built a carbonite freeze gun that he used to immobilize a security guard who remained frozen for approximately 10 years. He designed a weather control device, a hypnosis machine, a mind control apparatus specifically calibrated to harness and redirect Chris's physical size, a mass hypnosis device capable of affecting the general public, and a robotic duplicate of Peter designed to occupy Peter's side of the bed while Stewie executed other plans. He also built a battlecruiser small enough to fit inside a human cell, which he deployed against Peter's sperm in an episode where he was attempting to prevent Lois from becoming pregnant again. He once traveled back in time to prevent a sibling from being born. He did all of this while occupying a body that could not reliably reach the kitchen counter. The comedy of Stewie in those first 3 seasons came entirely from the distance between what he looked like and what he was. The show gave you a baby sitting in a yellow shirt in a high chair, eating food from a tiny spoon, surrounded by the domestic textures of a normal family home, while simultaneously delivering monologues about his plans to enslave humanity in the vocabulary and cadence of a Bond villain. The gap between those 2 registers was enormous, and the writers kept finding new ways to play with it, new angles on a joke that seemed endlessly renewable because the underlying absurdity was so rich. And then there was the Lois problem. Stewie genuinely wanted to kill his mother. This was not a metaphor for adolescent frustration or a comedic exaggeration of a normal child's ambivalence toward parental authority. He had an active, ongoing, seriously pursued project aimed at the death of Lois Griffin. The show treated it as a running plotline with genuine stakes. Stewie would make progress. He would be foiled. He would scheme again. He would construct new approaches to the same problem, each more elaborate than the last. What made this work was the dramatic irony of Lois's complete oblivion. She had no idea. She would pick Stewie up, hug him warmly, change his diaper, coo at him in the way that mothers coo at 1-year-olds, while being utterly unaware that the small person in her arms was actively reviewing the blueprints for her destruction. Every scene between them had this layer of tension running underneath the surface, the audience knowing what Lois did not, waiting for the moment when it would finally go wrong. This is sophisticated writing, technically speaking. The management of dramatic irony across an extended period requires careful calibration, because you need the audience to keep caring about the resolution of a tension that is never fully resolved. Too long without a near miss and the audience stops believing in the threat. Too many near misses without consequence and the threat becomes a running gag rather than genuine stakes. The early Stewie walked this line beautifully for 3 seasons. And then the show came back from its 3-year cancellation in 2005, and something began to shift. The shift was gradual, which is one of the things that makes it genuinely strange to examine in retrospect. Season 4 had Stewie still plotting against Lois, but the frequency of those plots decreased. His weapons still appeared, but they were no longer central to his storylines in the way they had been. His relationship with Brian began taking on more weight, more screen time, more emotional significance. The brilliant friendship between an evil genius baby and a world-weary talking dog started to move to the front of the show's attention. By Season 6, the 2-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie arrived, and it was widely received at the time as the definitive Stewie episode, the one that paid off everything the early seasons had been building toward. In the first part, Stewie finally does it. He shoots Lois on a cruise ship, sends her overboard, and then, over the following months, watches Peter be accused of her murder while he savors what he believes is his perfect crime. In the second part, Lois returns alive, Stewie kidnaps Brian and drives to Washington to take over the world, and the final confrontation between mother and son becomes everything you imagined it would be. And then the reveal comes. It was a simulation. Everything you just watched, the shooting, the trial, the world domination, the showdown was running inside a program on Stewie's computer. Lois walks in, perfectly safe, and turns it off. The episode is thrilling and enormously satisfying. It is also, in retrospect, a farewell. After Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie aired, the evil genius baby version of the character was effectively retired. The Lois killing plots faded from the show. The world domination schemes became callbacks and occasional jokes rather than ongoing storylines. The weapons remained as part of the show's visual shorthand for who Stewie is, but they stopped being deployed in service of actual plans. The new Stewie that emerged was emotional, insecure, interested in his identity and his relationships, prone to vulnerability in ways the old Stewie would have found genuinely contemptible. He was capable of warmth. He could be hurt. He wanted Brian to like him in a way that went beyond pure utility. He had what people who study character development call an arc, a trajectory from a closed, defended, calculating persona towards something more open and more human. And the show presented this as growth. As a natural evolution, as Stewie becoming more fully realized. The problem is that what the show gained, a character who could carry emotional weight, who could participate in genuine friendship, who could be the heart of an episode rather than just the punchline of one it gained, at the cost of something that was completely irreplaceable. Because the evil genius baby who built laser guns in his crib and plotted his mother's death between naps was one of the most genuinely original characters in the history of animated television. He occupied a space that no other character has ever occupied, before or since. He was not like anything else. He was not a variation on an existing type. He was something new. And the writers retired him because they felt they had exhausted the joke, because they believed the evil baby premise had run its course and further exploration of it would be repetitive. But here is the thing that the subsequent seasons proved beyond any reasonable argument. Family Guy kept making new episodes for more than 15 years after retiring Evil Stewie. If they could find enough material to sustain 15 seasons of the gentler, more emotionally available version of the character, it is essentially impossible to believe they could not have found more to do with one of the most creatively rich concepts in animation history. A 1-year-old with access to advanced technology and no moral constraints whatsoever. New targets, new inventions, new applications of existing capabilities, new dynamics with new characters. The possibilities were genuinely without ceiling. The evil genius baby was not a joke that had one punchline. It was a concept with infinite angles, and the writers chose to walk away from it. The mystery of why they made that choice, and whether it was truly about creative exhaustion or simply about ease, sits right at the center of the show's mythology. But the Stewie mystery does not end with his transformation. There is a deeper Stewie mystery, one that makes the first one look simple by comparison. And to reach it, we need to talk about what the show has implied, across multiple episodes, about what Stewie Griffin actually is. Section 4. The Universe According to Stewie, The Paradox of the Baby Who Made Everything. The episode is called The Big Bang Theory. It airs in Season 9, and it contains a revelation so large that the show seems almost embarrassed by it, presenting it as a joke and then moving rapidly past it before the audience has time to sit with what was just said. Here is what happens in the episode. Stewie and Brian end up outside the space-time continuum after a fight over control of the time machine sends them off course. Outside reality, the laws of physics do not apply. There is nothing there, no space, no time, no past or future, no universe at all. Just the two of them, floating in a condition that should not be possible. The only way back is to overload the return pad, a small companion device to the time machine that allows users to navigate back to their point of origin. The explosion from the overload is risky and potentially fatal, but it is the only option. Stewie and Brian do it. The explosion sends them back into reality. They arrive home. The story seems to be over. But then Stewie begins doing research. He compares the energy spectrum of the return pad's explosion with scientific data about the Big Bang, the originating event of the universe, the explosion from which all of space, time, matter, and energy emerged approximately 13.8 billion years ago. and the spectra match exactly. The conclusion the show draws is this: the return pad's explosion was the Big Bang. Stewie and Brian's escape from outside the space-time continuum was the event that created the universe. Everything that has ever existed, every star, every galaxy, every life form, every moment of history, from the formation of the first atoms to the current moment, exists because Stewie's return pad detonated in the void. This is presented as a joke. It plays for laughs, and it is funny. But if you pull back from the joke for a moment and look at what the show is actually saying, the implications are genuinely dizzying. Stewie Griffin created the universe. Not metaphorically, not as a comedic exaggeration. Within the established internal logic of the show, the one-year-old in the yellow shirt is the origin point of all existence. The Big Bang was his accident. The universe is his creation. The show also introduces, in the same episode, the concept of the causal loop that makes this possible. Stewie was born into a universe that his own future actions created. That universe produced him, he created it produced him again, in an infinite loop with no beginning and no end. Philosophers call this a bootstrap paradox, a closed causal loop where an event causes itself and there is no external point of origin. The show acknowledges this briefly, labels it a temporal causality loop in the dialogue, and moves on. But the question it opens is not one that Family Guy is capable of answering, and the show seems to know this, which is why it runs past the revelation rather than stopping to examine it. Because if Stewie created the universe, then everything in the show, every character, every episode, every joke, every moment of suffering and comedy and music and animation exists inside a creation that belongs to Stewie Griffin. The show takes place in Stewie's universe, which means that when the show treats Stewie as a character with a particular set of limitations and capabilities, it may be describing something that does not capture the full truth of what he is. A baby in a high chair, eating strained peas, who is also simultaneously the architect of all existence. A being whose casual accident produced the conditions for consciousness and life across the entire cosmos. There is a specific and uncomfortable question that follows naturally from this. If Stewie is the creator of the universe, even accidentally, what does that mean for his relationship with the people in it? With Lois, who he spent years trying to kill? With Peter, whose stupidity he has endured for every episode of his existence? With Meg, whose suffering he has witnessed and occasionally contributed to? Does the creator of the universe have any particular responsibility toward the people who exist within it? The show does not ask this. It does not want to. But once the revelation is in the room, you cannot fully unhear it. The time travel mythology of Family Guy creates additional mysteries that connect to the Stewie paradox in ways the show has never addressed. In the episode Road to Germany from Season 7, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel to 1939, where they find themselves navigating Nazi Germany in order to retrieve the fuel necessary to power the return pad and get home. The episode is darker than most Family Guy time travel stories, with genuine tension and a few moments of genuine menace. But what the episode establishes, in a detail the show does not follow up on, is that the time machine can reach any point in history. Not just the recent past, not just the convenient past, but genuinely any point, including, presumably, the moments before the events of the show began, including the moment Stan Thompson's name first appeared in the Screwed the Pooch courtroom, including the moment Meg was born, including any moment in any of these characters' histories that could be changed. Stewie has the ability to rewrite history. He has demonstrated this ability on multiple occasions. He has traveled to the past and altered events. And yet Meg's suffering continues, season after season, entirely unaddressed by the one character in the house who could theoretically intervene. This is not a plot hole in the conventional sense. Stewie's choices about when and where to use his technology are his own, and the show has never suggested he has any obligation to use them in service of Meg's well-being. But the contrast is stark and worth naming. The being who created the universe cannot be bothered to improve the circumstances of his sister, who lives in the same house and whose misery is visible to him every day. Maybe that tells us something about what Stewie actually values. Maybe it reveals something about the limits of his care for the people around him that the show has gradually expanded through his relationship with Brian, but that has never significantly extended toward Meg, toward Chris, or toward anyone outside his inner circle. There is something quietly disturbing about that portrait. a being of extraordinary and essentially unlimited capability, surrounded by people whose lives he could improve, choosing not to. Not out of malice, the later Stewie is not malicious in the way the early Stewie was, but out of simple indifference. The universe belongs to Stewie in some deep and literal sense, and the suffering of the people in it is not his problem unless he decides it is. That is a strange thing to put at the center of a comedy about a family. But Family Guy has always had stranger things at its center than the bright colors and the big laughs suggested. Section 5. The Time Machine's Broken Rules. What the show cannot decide about time. The time machine first appears in the very first season of Family Guy. In the episode Mind Over Murder, Stewie builds it specifically to fast forward past the pain of teething, which is a perfect early Stewie decision because it demonstrates that his extraordinary capability is entirely in service of his immediate comfort. He moves time forward, everyone around him loses hours of their lives without knowing it, and then he moves it back when things get complicated. From this point, the time machine becomes a recurring element of the show's mythology. Brian and Stewie use it across dozens of episodes to travel to the past, to the future, to alternate timelines, and in at least one case to the space outside time itself. The adventures they have with it produce some of the most beloved episodes in the show's run: Road to Germany, Back to the Pilot, the Big Bang Theory episode, and they establish a dynamic between the two characters that functions separately from, and often more compellingly, than any of Stewie's interactions with the rest of the family. The problem is that the show cannot maintain consistent rules about how the time machine works. This is understandable in isolation. Any science fiction premise involving time travel will eventually produce inconsistencies if it runs long enough. But the Family Guy time machine's inconsistencies are not just cosmetic. They involve the fundamental stakes of what the machine can and cannot do, and the inconsistency matters because those stakes determine what the characters can and cannot change, which determines what the show's universe actually allows to be permanent. Consider the episode Yug Yilimov from Season 11. Brian uses the time machine without permission and, in attempting to cover his tracks, accidentally reverses the flow of time across the entire universe. Time runs backward. Events unmake themselves. Pregnancies reverse. People unlearn things they have already learned. The causal fabric of reality begins to unravel because a dog misused a piece of baby equipment. The consequences are genuinely existential in scale. The universe itself is at risk. The stakes could not possibly be higher. And the episode treats this with appropriate if comedic gravity. Now consider how casually the time machine is used in other episodes. In Road to Germany, Brian and Stewie grab a ride in it with essentially the same energy you would use to call a taxi. In Back to the Pilot, they travel to 1999 to observe the first episode of the show as a nostalgic lark. In various other episodes, the machine is deployed to solve minor inconveniences, to retrieve lost objects, to settle bets. The apparatus that nearly unraveled all of existence in Yug Yilimov is treated in most contexts as a slightly dangerous toy. The show needs it to be an existential threat when it needs big stakes and a fun toy when it needs to enable adventures, and it shifts between those two registers without acknowledging the tension between them. The audience is expected to hold both versions simultaneously and simply forget the inconsistency, because the episodes are funny enough that dwelling on it feels like the wrong kind of attention. But the inconsistency has a practical consequence that the show introduces in Season 12 and then resolves in a way that creates a permanent logical problem. When Brian dies in Life of Brian, Stewie cannot go back and save him because he has already destroyed the time machine. The destruction of the machine is what makes Brian's death feel permanent. It removes the obvious escape hatch and forces the show to commit to what seems like a genuine, lasting consequence. Then, 2 episodes later, Stewie encounters an alternate timeline version of himself at the mall, who still has a functioning return pad. Stewie borrows it, goes back in time, and saves Brian. This is a satisfying resolution in the moment. It is also, when examined closely, a revelation about how the Family Guy universe actually works that the show has no interest in fully exploring. If alternate timelines exist in which different versions of Stewie walk around with different versions of his equipment, then the destruction of the primary time machine was never actually the permanent limitation the show implied it was. There are other Stewies in other timelines carrying other pads. The escape hatch was always available. This means that Brian's death was never as permanent as the show presented it, not because the show cheated retroactively, but because the rules it had already established for its own universe made the permanence impossible from the start. Any sufficiently motivated version of Stewie can always reach across a timeline and undo whatever needs undoing. And the show has never grappled with what this implies. If no death and no loss in this universe is truly permanent, because Stewie's technology and the existence of alternate timelines always provide a workaround, then what does loss actually mean in Quahog? What does any permanent change mean? When the show occasionally allows a character to stay dead, as it did after And Then There Were Fewer, is that actually a special case, or is it just a case where nobody thought to ask Stewie to borrow a return pad? The Time Machine, and the universe of time travel lore that has built up around it across 25 seasons, is one of the deepest and most unresolved elements of the show's mythology. It has produced some of the most memorable episodes in the series. It has established the emotional core of the Brian-Stewie relationship, and it has also created a set of logical consequences that the show has never been willing to follow to their natural conclusions, because those conclusions would require the show to commit to what it actually believes about permanence and consequence. A show that is comfortable with the idea that nothing is permanent, that every ending has a workaround available to anyone clever enough to reach for it, is a show with a particular relationship to consequences. And Family Guy's relationship to consequences is, and has always been, complicated. Section 6. The Gun in the Vault, Brian Griffin's Darkest Secret. In May of 2010, Family Guy aired what is, by some measures, the most unusual and most affecting episode it has ever produced. The episode is called Brian and Stewie. It is the 17th episode of the 8th season, and it was the show's 150th episode overall, and it is, without question, unlike anything else the show has made before or since. The setup is simple, almost to the point of severity. Brian and Stewie go to the local bank together so Brian can access his safe deposit box. While they are still in the vault, the door closes at the end of the business day and locks automatically. They are alone in a sealed room with no working phone, no access to the outside world, and nothing to eat or drink, except the contents of Brian's safe deposit box. They are there until Monday morning. What follows is the closest thing Family Guy has ever produced to a pure stage play. There are no cutaway gags, not one. There is no background music, none at all, which gives the episode an unusual and slightly eerie quiet that catches you off guard if you have been watching the show normally. There are no other characters, no other locations, no set changes. Just two characters in a room, with the slow and grinding passage of time doing what time always does when you have nowhere to go and nothing to hide behind. The episode's comedy is real but uncomfortable. There is a sequence involving a soiled diaper and Brian's desperate attempts to deal with the consequences that is genuinely unpleasant. There is a moment where Stewie wastes the phone's last battery life, calling a clothing store to complain about a sweater rather than calling for help. There is the discovery of a bottle of scotch in Brian's box, and the drunken, slightly destructive conversation that follows. And then Stewie sees the gun. Brian has a firearm in his safe deposit box. Not bullets, he says, there are no bullets in it, though the episode later suggests this may not be entirely true. But a gun in a bank vault with a bottle of expensive scotch? These are specific, deliberately chosen items. They are not there by accident. And Stewie, with the directness of a small child who has not yet learned to avoid the questions adults most want to avoid, asks why. Brian tries to deflect. He gives a few different answers before Stewie makes clear that none of them are sufficient and that he actually wants to know. And Brian, drunk and trapped in a room with no exits and a companion who will not let the question go, tells the truth. The scotch and the gun are there for the day when Brian has had enough. When living the life he has, the failed writing, the romantic disasters, the drinking, the constant sense of being almost but not quite what he was supposed to be, becomes something he can no longer sustain. He keeps them in a bank vault rather than at home, so that the decision, when he makes it, will be made deliberately. He will have to come to this specific place, open this specific box, sit with the weight of what he is about to do. The vault is not just a storage location, it is a waiting period built into the plan. The scotch is for the last drink, and then the gun. Stewie's response is the emotional center of the episode, and one of the genuinely remarkable moments in the show's history. He is visibly distressed in a way that the show rarely allows him to be, not performing distress as a comedic beat, but actually upset, in whatever way a one-year-old genius processes genuine emotional pain. He tells Brian that he does not want this. He says that he would be lost without him. That Brian is the only one in his life who truly understands what Stewie is, who can speak to him as an equal, who genuinely sees him pass the diaper and the infant body to the person underneath. It is honest in a way that the show almost never manages. It is honest in the way that only happens when two people are trapped somewhere with no way to perform for an outside audience, and all the usual social maintenance collapses, and what is actually true comes up through the floor. Brian tells Stewie that he lied about the gun having no bullets. There are bullets. The gun is real and loaded and functional. Stewie, in a reflex of horror and anger, smacks the gun out of Brian's hands. And then, eventually, the vault opens. They go home, and the episode ends. The mystery that the episode leaves sitting in the room is this: when did Brian make this plan? The show does not say. The vault has been maintained at some point before this episode. Brian knows the combination, has kept the box current, and made what sounds like a considered and specific preparation, not a passing dark thought, but an actual logistical arrangement. A last drink and then the gun? This is the kind of planning that requires a particular clarity of mind about one's own intentions, a particular willingness to look at a possible future and decide that it is a real option. What were the circumstances? What was happening in Brian's life when he decided to set this up? The show does not tell us and does not try to. And after the episode ends, the gun is never mentioned again. It does not appear in subsequent episodes. It is not referenced in passing. The profound revelation that Brian Griffin has prepared for the possibility of his own death has made actual logistical arrangements, for it is folded back into the private interior of a character who returns to his usual life, with no visible acknowledgement that something significant just happened. This is perhaps the most realistic thing Family Guy has ever done, and it is realistic in a way the show probably did not intend, because this is often how it works in real life. Someone says something true and painful in an unguarded moment, and then the moment passes and life resumes its usual shape, and the thing that was said does not get addressed in any sustained way, because addressing it would require a sustained kind of attention that is harder to maintain than a single, honest conversation. The vault closes and everyone pretends the gun is not there. What we are left with is an image: a white Labrador in a suit, sitting in a bank vault with a bottle of good scotch and a loaded gun, waiting for the day when the decision feels right. This is what Brian Griffin is carrying beneath the martinis, and the literary ambitions, and the failed romances, and the casual banter with Stewie. A plan, a prepared exit, something he has thought through carefully enough to make physical, practical arrangements for. And then 3 seasons after this episode aired, Brian dies. Not by the plan he made, not in the vault with the scotch and the gun. He dies in the street, hit by a car, by accident, while playing street hockey with Stewie on an ordinary afternoon. The ending he had prepared for himself, controlled, deliberate, on his own terms, was taken from him by random chance on a Tuesday afternoon. Is that better? Is it worse? The show does not say. It was not thinking about the gun when it wrote the car accident. The events are probably not connected in the writer's room's intentions. But in the mythology, the show has built the accumulated universe of character history and revealed backstory and planted mysteries. The gun is there. The vault is there. And the Brian who walked out to play street hockey that afternoon had a plan sitting in a safe deposit box downtown that he never got to use, one way or the other. Section 7. Life of Brian and the Death That Asked Everything. On the 24th of November 2013, Brian Griffin died. The episode that killed him was Season 12's 6th installment, Life of Brian, and it made national news. It trended on social media. It generated news coverage in outlets that did not typically concern themselves with animated sitcom deaths. Fans who had barely thought about Family Guy in years were suddenly and viscerally invested in what had happened. There was genuine grief, widespread and vocal, for a cartoon dog who had been part of a television show for 14 years. The setup, which, in retrospect, has a particular poignancy, began with Stewie destroying his own time machine. He made this decision deliberately, citing exhaustion with the accidents and the near misses and the general catastrophe that surrounded every use of the device. The destruction was presented as final and significant. The machine was gone. Shortly after, Brian and Stewie set up a street hockey net in front of the Griffin house. Stewie goes inside briefly to retrieve something. While he is gone, a car moving too fast comes around the corner. Brian is hit. He survives long enough to be brought to a veterinary clinic, long enough for the family to gather around him. He tells them he loves them, and then he dies. The family mourns. A funeral happens. A new dog, Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, arrives to fill the empty space in the household. Vinny is different from Brian in every significant way. Louder, less intellectual, more immediately warm, a deliberate contrast. His presence confirmed that Brian's death was intended to stick. 2 episodes later, it did not. In the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie encountered a version of himself from a slightly different point in the timeline. This alternate Stewie was carrying a return pad, the navigation device that worked alongside the time machine. The destruction of the time machine had not eliminated all versions of Stewie's technology across all possible timelines. It had only eliminated this specific version, in this specific timeline. Stewie borrowed the return pad. He went back in time to the afternoon of the street hockey game. He pushed Brian out of the path of the oncoming car. Brian survived. Everything returned to normal. Vinny was gone, quietly erased from a timeline he had occupied for 2 episodes. Seth MacFarlane said afterward that the production team was genuinely surprised by the strength of the audience's reaction, that they had not anticipated the depth of feeling that Brian's death generated. He framed this as a positive discovery proof that the audience still cared deeply about Brian as a character after more than a decade on television. Executive producer Steve Callahan, in a separate statement, explained that the storyline was conceived as a way to shake things up, to remind the audience that the show was still capable of doing something unexpected and consequential. The mystery that Brian's death and resurrection creates is not whether the show had the right to bring him back. The mystery is what the resurrection reveals about the show's relationship to consequence. When Stewie destroyed the time machine at the beginning of Life of Brian, the show established a specific narrative logic. The tool that could have undone Brian's death was gone. The absence of the machine was what made the death feel real. The show had removed its own escape hatch, but the alternate timeline return pad was always there. In the logic of the universe the show had already built. Alternate timelines are established in Family Guy as real and accessible. Other Stewies exist. Other versions of the equipment exist. The escape hatch was not actually gone, it was just one step harder to reach than usual. Which means that nothing in the Family Guy universe is ever truly permanent. Brian's death was presented as permanent. It was not. Any death that happens in Quahog could in principle be undone by a motivated Stewie with access to any version of his technology from any adjacent timeline. The architecture of the show's time travel mythology makes genuine permanence impossible. And yet the show wants specific deaths to matter. It wants the deaths in "and then there were fewer" to be permanent. It wants certain consequences to stick. It wants the audience to believe that sometimes things cannot be undone. This is a contradiction at the heart of the show's mythology, and it is one the show has never resolved, because resolving it would require a level of commitment to consistent rules that Family Guy has never been willing to make. But there is another mystery in Brian's death and return that is more immediate and more psychologically interesting than the time travel logic. The replacement dog Vinny existed for 2 episodes. In those 2 episodes, he was kind to the Griffin family. He was gentle with Stewie. He made dinner. He began, slowly, to fill a specific role in a specific household. And then Stewie's intervention erased him, retroactively, as if he had never existed. Within the logic of the time travel, Vinny simply does not become the Griffin family's dog. The change Stewie makes produces a world in which Brian lives and Vinny is never brought home. From inside the show's universe, Vinny's role in the Griffin family is eliminated from history. But from the audience's perspective, from the perspective of anyone who watched those 2 episodes, Vinny existed. He was real in the only way fictional characters are ever real. He occupied a space. He had a voice and a personality and a warmth. And he was erased not by the logic of his own story, but by the mechanics of a time travel resolution. This is a kind of mystery the show has never examined. What is the moral weight of erasing a character through time travel? When Stewie went back and saved Brian, he also, by implication, removed Vinny from the life he had just begun to build. The show did not think about this because Vinny was a temporary replacement rather than a character the show invested in. But the question is there, in the margins of the mythology, waiting for someone to notice it. Brian came back. That was the right outcome. But something else went with him, quietly, when Stewie pushed him out of the car's path. And no one in the show was paying attention to that part. Section 8. The Age of Quagmire, a mystery written in driver's license data. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most consistently present characters in the history of Family Guy. He has appeared since the first season in a configuration that has remained essentially stable across the show's entire run. The loudly sexual neighbor across from the Griffins, Peter's closest friend at the Drunken Clam, an airline pilot with a red 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air and a habit of living well past the boundaries of acceptable behavior. He has been present for every major event in Quahog's strange and chaotic history. He has been in hundreds of episodes. He is, in many ways, as central to the show's texture as any of the Griffin family members. He is also, according to documents displayed on screen in Season 7, 61 years old. The episode Foxy Lady gives the audience a clear view of Quagmire's driver's license. It was issued in Rhode Island. It gives his birth year as 1948. At the time of the episode's airing in 2009, that would make him 61, which Peter immediately and accurately identifies as impossible, given everything the audience can see about the man standing in front of him. Quagmire attributes his youthful appearance to carrots. The joke lands. The scene moves on. But what the scene leaves behind is a factual statement, delivered via on-screen prop in a context that was not satirizing the idea of official documents, it was simply showing us one. Within the show's internal logic, that driver's license is real. Quagmire was born in 1948. He is 61 years old when the show says he is 61 years old. Except that the show has also shown us other things about Quagmire's past that make a 1948 birth year essentially impossible to reconcile. In the Season 6 episode Meet the Quagmires, Brian travels back in time to 1984. In 1984, he encounters a young Quagmire who is clearly meant to be roughly the same age as the young Peter and young Lois, that the episode also shows us approximately 18 or 19, a teenager on the edge of adulthood. Peter is consistently portrayed as having been around 18 in 1984. Lois is similarly positioned. If Quagmire was born in 1948, he would have been 36 years old in 1984. Not 18. The episode does not address this. It cannot address it without acknowledging an inconsistency it was never meant to have. There is also an episode set partially in the context of high school attendance in 1986. The implications of Quagmire's presence in a high school setting in 1986 are, again, incompatible with a 1948 birth year. A man born in 1948 would have been 38 in 1986, not a teenager navigating the social dynamics of high school. Seth MacFarlane has addressed the inconsistency in interviews, explaining that the 61-year-old revelation was always meant to be a joke, the comedic premise being that Quagmire looks and acts decades younger than his biological age would suggest, and the carrot explanation was a deliberate absurdity. The actual intent was never to establish a firm canonical age that the show would need to reconcile with its other timeline elements. But here is where the mystery becomes genuinely interesting rather than just a continuity error. The driver's license was real. It appeared on screen. It was legible. And if we take the show at its word, if we extend to Family Guy the same basic courtesy of believing that what it puts on screen is true within its own universe, then Quagmire was born in 1948, and everything the show has also shown us about his past as a roughly peer-aged figure alongside Peter and Lois in the 1980s, must be reconciled with that. Within the internal logic of a show that contains time machines and talking dogs and a baby who accidentally created the universe, a man who appears 30 years younger than his biological age is not inherently impossible. It is unusual. It is worth explaining. But it is not ruled out. So what happened to Glenn Quagmire? What is the explanation, within the rules of this universe, for a man born in 1948 who appears to be in his mid-30s in the 1980s and who still appears to be in his mid-30s in 2009? The show does not say, it introduced the detail and then expected the audience to treat it as a throwaway gag rather than a genuine mystery about the nature of one of its main characters. But in a universe that contains extraordinary things, a man who does not age conventionally is not just a joke. He is something that deserves an explanation. The darker dimensions of Quagmire's backstory add layers to this mystery that the show has approached carefully but never fully illuminated. In Season 12's The Stowaway, Quagmire reveals that his first sexual experience occurred when he was 6 years old, under circumstances that were not chosen and not consensual. The show presents this briefly, in the context of an episode that is primarily concerned with other things, and then moves on. But the detail sits in the mythology. Quagmire, whose entire character is built around an apparently boundless and cheerful sexual appetite, whose catchphrase is the sound of his own enthusiasm, whose defining trait across hundreds of episodes is a kind of relentless pursuit of physical pleasure. This character has an origin story that begins with something done to him rather than something he chose. The show has never connected these two facts explicitly. It has never suggested that the behavior Quagmire exhibits across the series has any relationship to the thing that was done to him when he was 6. Whether or not such a connection was intended, and it probably was not, given the show's general approach to continuity and the care it takes with backstory, the connection is available in the mythology. A character whose early experience of sexuality was coercive, who subsequently became defined by the most aggressive possible pursuit of sexual encounters, is a character whose behavior takes on a different texture when you hold both pieces of information in the same hand. The show has also touched on Quagmire's relationship with his mother in ways that the show's usual broad comic register makes difficult to parse, but that clearly point towards something disturbing. The episode Quagmire's Mom involves implications about the nature of the mother-son relationship that the show has orbited without landing on a clear statement of what it means. These implications, taken alongside the childhood assault revelation, paint a picture of a character whose psychological history is considerably more complex and considerably darker than the cheerful, extroverted persona he presents to the world. What is Quagmire carrying? What is the weight behind the giggity? The show has given us pieces of the answer scattered across its mythology, and then consistently declined to assemble them into a picture it would have to stand behind. The age mystery is almost the least of it. A man born in 1948 who looks 35 is strange and unexplained. A man who has survived and apparently thrived despite a traumatic early history, who presents relentless cheerfulness as a defense against something the show has never properly named, that is a deeper mystery. And it is one the show has been constructing, piece by piece, without ever quite acknowledging what it is building. Section 9. And then there were fewer the canon murder mystery. In September of 2010, Family Guy opened its 9th season with an hour-long episode that no one who saw it had quite expected. Based on Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, the episode invited most of the show's recurring cast to a remote mansion under mysterious circumstances and then began killing them. And Then There Were Fewer is remarkable for several reasons. It is one of the best plotted episodes Family Guy has ever produced. It is also, as confirmed by Seth MacFarlane, a fully canonical entry in the show's mythology. The deaths that occur in it stayed dead. This was not a dream, and it was not a simulation, and it was not a trick. Characters died in that mansion and did not return. The setup follows Christie's original structure with considerable fidelity. Anonymous invitations are sent to a wide cross-section of Quahog's population: the Griffins, Quagmire, Joe and Bonnie, Tom Tucker, Muriel Goldman, Mort Goldman, and various others. Each invitation claims that the dinner is being held in the specific recipient's honor. When the guests arrive at the cliffside mansion, they discover each other with surprise. Each had believed the invitation was personal and exclusive. The host, when he finally reveals himself, is James Woods. He is born again, reformed, transformed by a religious conversion engineered by his girlfriend Priscilla, and he wants to apologize to all the people he has harmed across the years. He has a ledger in his study which the guests discover through one of the episode's many secrets passages, listing every misdeed and the person it was committed against. And then someone kills James Woods. The remainder of the episode operates as a genuine mystery story. The guests are stranded, the bridge is out, the phones do not work, and the killer is still somewhere in the building. Characters examine the evidence. Alibis are checked and found wanting. The circle of suspects narrows through a combination of investigation and more deaths. The killer is ultimately revealed to be Diane Simmons, Tom Tucker's co-anchor at Quahog's Channel 5 News. Diane's life has been on a downward trajectory for years, anchored by two specific grievances. James Woods had dated her and then left, and Tom Tucker had replaced her as co-anchor with a younger woman. When Diane turned 40, she orchestrated the entire evening as a setup. James Woods would die, Tom Tucker would be framed, and Diane would walk away clean. When her plan began to unravel with the accidental death of Stephanie instead of the planned murder of Tom Tucker, she improvised. Additional deaths: Priscilla, Muriel Goldman, Derek Wilcox were committed to protect the secret. By the time the episode reaches its final act, Diane has killed 4 people and is holding Lois at gunpoint on a cliff. The episode ends with Diane being shot from a distance. The shooter is Stewie. MacFarlane confirmed that the deaths in this episode are permanent. Muriel Goldman does not return to the show after this episode. Diane Simmons, who had been a recurring character for years, is gone. The episode is canon, and its consequences are real. This is one of the genuinely unusual moments in Family Guy's history, a moment when the show committed to consequences in a way it almost never does. And the permanence of those deaths creates a mystery that has hung over the show's mythology ever since. The mystery is not who killed whom. The murder plot is resolved clearly within the episode. The mystery is why these deaths stay permanent when so many other things in this show do not. Consider the asymmetry. Brian Griffin died and was brought back through time travel. Peter Griffin has survived things that should have killed him on dozens of occasions. The rules of death in the Family Guy universe are, in almost every other context, extremely flexible. Even Death himself was temporarily incapacitated in the show's own mythology, and during his incapacitation, characters survived things they should not have. But Muriel Goldman and Diane Simmons stay dead. The show decided, in this specific instance, to commit. And the commitment produces a question. Why here? What makes these deaths different from the deaths that get walked back? The answer is probably that the episode was explicitly designed as a Christie pastiche, and Christie's stories depend on permanent death. The genre requires it. You cannot have an Agatha Christie mystery where the murder victim is brought back to life in the third act. The rules of the genre were doing work that the show's usual flexible approach to consequences would have undermined. But this creates a strange situation in the mythology. The show maintains different rules about permanence depending on what genre it is invoking at the time. A death in a parody of a Christie novel stays. A death in a regular episode might not. The universe does not have consistent rules about which deaths count. It has contextual rules that shift based on what kind of story is being told that week. There is also the Stewie question that, and then there were fewer, raises and never answers. When Stewie shoots Diane from a distance at the end of the episode protecting Lois, saving his mother's life, the show presents this as a resolution without acknowledging what it means. This is the same Stewie who spent 3 seasons building weapons specifically designed to kill this woman. He had elaborate plans. He had near misses. He had entire episodes organized around his obsession with her death. And here, at the edge of a cliff in the rain, he saves her life. Without comment, without the episode acknowledging the profound irony of the moment, without any version of Stewie noting that the baby who once planted listening devices in Lois's bedroom and built carbonite guns to use against her, is now taking a long-range shot to keep her alive. The show just has it happen, and moves on. The deepest mystery in And Then There Were Fewer is the one about character consistency. Stewie's decision to save Lois is presented as natural, as clearly the right thing to do, as an expression of who he has become since the early seasons. But the show never draws the line explicitly between who he was and who he is now in this moment. It never says, here is the point at which Stewie's relationship with his mother changed from something he wanted to destroy to something he would kill to protect. It just assumes you have noticed the change and moved on. The episode confirmed that permanent things can happen in Quahog, that consequences can stick, that the show is capable, when it chooses to be, of building a story and standing behind its outcome. The mystery is why it so rarely chooses to be. Section 10. Screams of Silence. The episode, Family Guy Could Not Carry. In October of 2011, Family Guy aired an episode about domestic violence. It was Halloween week. The episode is called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. This is one of the most debated and most uncomfortable pieces of content the show has ever produced. Not because it was gratuitously offensive in the way that generates typical Family Guy controversy, not because of a joke that went too far, or a reference that pushed past the line of acceptable provocation. The discomfort of this episode is of a completely different, and in some ways more troubling character. It failed because it tried to do something serious and discovered, in the process of trying, that it was not equipped to do it. The episode focuses on Brenda, Quagmire's sister, who was introduced briefly in an earlier episode as being in a relationship with an abusive man named Jeff. Jeff is portrayed as immediately and obviously abusive. The episode does not make any attempt to obscure this or to present the situation as ambiguous. Jeff is violent, controlling, and contemptuous. Brenda shows signs of classic patterns associated with abusive relationships. Defending the abuser, minimizing the harm, refusing to accept help when it is offered. The episode watches as Quagmire discovers the extent of what his sister is experiencing. It then follows his attempts to get her out of the relationship conversations, and intervention, appeals to reason and to her love for her brother. None of it works. Brenda remains committed to Jeff in a way that Quagmire, Peter, and Joe cannot penetrate through words alone. And so they make a different decision. They take Jeff on what is described as a midnight hunting trip. They kill him. Brenda is told through a fabricated letter that Jeff walked away and chose to leave. The episode ends with Brenda apparently beginning to rebuild her life on the basis of this lie. The mystery of Screams of Silence is not what happened in the narrative. The sequence of events is clear. The mystery is what the show thought it was doing, what it believed it was saying, and what the gap between its intention and its execution reveals about the show's capacity for genuine engagement with difficult subjects. The episode's first problem is tonal. Family Guy is a show built on a particular kind of comedy that depends on a willingness to find everything funny, including things that are deeply unfunny in their real-world form. The show has made jokes about violence, abuse, assault, and death across its entire run. These jokes are part of the show's identity. They are frequently the target of criticism. They are also, within the show's established language, expected and therefore navigable. The audience knows the register they are in. Screams of Silence attempts to shift registers completely for the duration of an episode and treat domestic violence as something serious, something not subject to the usual comedic distance the show maintains. And this creates an immediate and unresolvable problem, because the audience cannot simply forget how the show has talked about these things before. The comedic register is still in the room, even when the show is trying to leave it. The jokes that surround the serious scenes, some of them genuinely tasteless in the specific context of an episode about domestic abuse, make the serious scenes feel unstable, like they are happening in the wrong genre. The show's second problem is structural. The resolution it chooses, murder, followed by a comforting lie, does not say what it thinks it says about the subject it is addressing. The episode seems to believe that by taking domestic violence seriously enough to refuse to make the abuse itself a punchline, and by giving Quagmire a genuine emotional investment in his sister's safety, it is doing something meaningful and respectful. But the resolution, removing the problem through violence, then lying to the victim about what happened, places Brenda's safety entirely outside Brenda's own agency. She does not escape. She does not find resources. She does not make a decision. The three men in her life make a decision for her, carry it out without her knowledge, and then present her with a manufactured version of events that she is expected to accept and move forward from. What does Brenda know at the end of this episode? She knows that Jeff is gone. She believes he chose to leave. She is pregnant with his child. She will raise that child under a false understanding of what happened to their father. And the people who were supposed to be her support system, her brother, his friends, are now carrying a secret about her own life that she is not entitled to know. The episode presents this as a resolution, as the best possible outcome, as Quagmire's love for his sister expressed through decisive action, and it may genuinely be the most loving thing anyone has ever done for Brenda in the world of this show. But it is also, when examined, a story in which the victim ends the episode with less information about her own life than she started with. She had Jeff's violence, which was real and present, and something she was navigating every day, even if her navigation of it was self-destructive. Now she has a lie and a pregnancy and no idea what actually happened. She has been protected from violence and simultaneously excluded from truth. The message the episode communicates, whether or not it intended to, is that victims of abuse cannot be trusted with the facts of their own situations. That the correct response to a person in an abusive relationship is to remove the abuser, keep the methods secret, and present a comfortable fiction to replace the uncomfortable reality. This is not a trivial thing to accidentally say in an episode of a television show that was reaching millions of viewers. And the show has never revisited it, never examined it, never suggested any awareness that the episode landed differently than intended. The mystery of Screams of Silence is the mystery of good intentions meeting insufficient tools. The show wanted to say something meaningful about domestic violence. It said something meaningful, but the meaning was not quite what it intended. And the gap between what it tried to do and what it actually did is a window into the limits of what Family Guy is capable of sustaining. A comedy that has spent years making difficult things funny cannot simply decide for 22 minutes to stop making difficult things funny and expect the difficult things to behave themselves. The genre expectations are in the room. The audience's conditioned responses are in the room, and the writers, who have spent years in a particular register, do not fully leave that register just because the subject matter of a given episode seems to require it. Brenda vanishes after this episode. Jeff is dead in the woods somewhere. The pregnancy presumably continues. The lie holds, and the show moves on to its next episode without looking back. Some doors once opened should not simply be pulled shut. Section 11. Peter Griffin's actual history, the man behind the idiot. At the center of Family Guy, for more than 25 years, sits a man named Peter Griffin. He is the title character in the most literal sense. The show is called Family Guy, and he is the family guy, the blue-collar patriarch of a household in Rhode Island whose adventures and disasters form the organizing spine of the show's narrative. But who is Peter Griffin, actually? What does the show's own accumulated mythology tell us about this man when you gather all the pieces together in one place and look at them seriously? The answer is considerably stranger and considerably darker than the premise suggests. Start with the name. Peter was born Justin Peter Griffin, according to documents presented in the episode Quagmire's Mom. The name Peter does not appear to be his given first name. The show has never explained when or why the shift to Peter occurred, what circumstances produced it, or whether this detail has any significance beyond a throwaway piece of biographical trivia. Now go to the parentage. Peter spent the early years of the show as the son of Francis and Thelma Griffin, Francis being a devout, demanding, often cold man whose religious conservatism and high standards made Peter's childhood difficult. Francis was not warm. He was not nurturing. He had expectations of Peter that Peter consistently failed to meet, and the relationship between them was defined more by disappointment and judgment than by the kind of unconditional acceptance that is supposed to characterize parental love. Then, in Season 5's episode Peter's Two Dads, the show reveals that Francis Griffin was Peter's stepfather. Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman, rough and hard-drinking, who had an affair with Peter's mother, Thelma, at some point before or during her marriage to Francis. Peter discovers this, tracks Mickey down to Ireland, and the resulting encounter is played for both comedy and a kind of wistful emotional weight. The detail that is most significant about this revelation is not the discovery of the biological father, though that is important enough, but the shape of the family situation it describes. Peter was raised by a stepfather who was cold and demanding, without knowing that his real father was someone else. He absorbed Francis Griffin's disappointment in him without the context that would have allowed him to understand why the relationship felt the way it did. He grew up carrying the weight of a man's expectations while being, in some fundamental sense, not that man's son. This is a complicated and painful setup. It is the kind of backstory that, in a show committed to exploring its characters with care, would illuminate everything about who Peter became. A man raised by someone who was always slightly distant, who came from a biological father he never knew, who was wanted by neither parent in quite the way children need to be wanted. This is a recognizable portrait of how certain kinds of damage get transmitted across generations. The show does not connect these dots explicitly. It introduces the revelations and then moves on, leaving the audience to draw whatever conclusions they are going to draw without guidance from the text itself. Then there is Peter's actual birth, which the show addresses in the episode Padre de Familia. It is revealed that Peter was born in Mexico, where his mother Thelma had traveled specifically to obtain an abortion. The procedure was not successful. Peter was born in Mexico rather than in the United States, making him technically a Mexican-born citizen despite having been raised in New England and having spent his entire adult life as a loudly, performatively patriotic American. This revelation is used in the episode to explore immigration and citizenship politics in a satirical frame, with Peter discovering that his status is more complicated than he believed. The comedy is broad and the episode moves quickly, but the factual statement at its center is a striking one. Peter Griffin was born because his mother failed to prevent him from being born in a foreign country, under circumstances that were not intended to produce his existence. This is a dark origin for a main character. The show presents it lightly, as it presents almost everything, but the weight of it is available if you choose to carry it. Peter Griffin was not wanted, initially, by the woman who raised him. He was raised by a stepfather who was never fully warm to him. His biological father was a stranger who lived in another country. His name may not be his actual given name. He was born in Mexico and spent his whole life claiming an American identity built on an incomplete understanding of his own origins. Now add to this the detail that the show reveals in scattered episodes about Peter's childhood beyond the Francis Griffin dynamic. His sister Karen, who appears in the episode Peter's Sister, is revealed to have been physically and emotionally abusive toward Peter when they were children. This abuse was serious enough to leave lasting marks. Meg, in the episode where this is revealed, comes to understand her father's cruelty toward her as partly a cycle that was established in his own childhood, the damage done to him being passed down, as damage tends to be, in altered forms. This is again a coherent and genuinely affecting piece of character writing. A man who was abused as a child, who never had proper tools for processing that experience, who passes its residue along to his own children, through behavior he may not even fully understand as connected to his own history. This is a recognizable portrait of intergenerational trauma. And then the show hits the reset button at the end of the episode. Peter learns something important about himself and about why he treats Meg the way he does. There is a reconciliation. There is genuine emotion. And then the following episode, Peter's behavior toward Meg is exactly what it was before the revelation. The cycle continues. Nothing changed. This is the deepest mystery of Peter Griffin's identity. Not the name, not the father, not the birthplace. Though all of these are genuine mysteries worth examining. The deepest mystery is why the show keeps building a coherent picture of who Peter is and how he got that way, and then refusing to do anything with it. The pieces of Peter Griffin's story, assembled together, describe a character whose life has been shaped by abandonment and cruelty and a chronic deficit of genuine care. Every abusive tendency, every failure of empathy, every moment of casual cruelty toward the people he is supposed to love, all of it has roots that the show has put on screen and then chosen not to follow. The show knows who Peter Griffin is. The evidence is in the episodes, scattered across 25 seasons. What it cannot decide is whether it wants to actually tell his story. Section 12. The world, the show built, and the rules it chose to break. Every long-running show accumulates inconsistencies. This is an unavoidable consequence of producing hundreds of hours of content over decades, with different writing teams contributing different pieces of the mythology across different seasons. The Simpsons has them. Every show that has run long enough has them. Inconsistency is not a crime in narrative television. But Family Guy's inconsistencies are notable not just for their quantity but for their character. Many of the show's most significant inconsistencies involve the fundamental rules of how the universe works, the deepest, most load-bearing elements of the premise. And when the load-bearing walls shift, everything built on top of them shifts too. The question of who can hear Stewie is the most persistently mysterious of these foundational inconsistencies, and it is the one that has the most significant downstream effects on the show's mythology. In the earliest seasons, the rule seemed clear enough. Most people could not hear Stewie clearly. They heard babbling or vague sounds, or something that did not register as language. Brian was the exception. He could hear Stewie perfectly, understand him completely, and respond to him as an equal. This exceptional quality was presented as the specific foundation of their friendship. Brian was not just a dog who happened to be in the same house as an evil genius baby. He was the only person in Stewie's world who could actually see past the diaper and the high chair and reach the intelligence inside. But as the show continued, this rule eroded quietly and without announcement. Characters who previously should not have been able to understand Stewie began having full conversations with him. Chris, who in early seasons clearly heard something other than language when Stewie spoke, by later seasons was engaging in dialogue with him without any explanation for how this became possible. Lois, who the early show depicted as hearing only her baby, occasionally seemed to respond to Stewie's actual words in later seasons, though the show maintained enough ambiguity around this that it was never quite a clean reversal. The show acknowledged the problem in the episode Love Blackshally, when Brian and Stewie explicitly discuss which characters can and cannot understand Stewie and arrive at an answer that amounts to, "We are not sure," and the rules seem to vary. This is a genuinely funny moment of self-awareness. It is also the show confessing, in plain language, that it stopped tracking one of its own fundamental rules and cannot now reconstruct what those rules were supposed to be. The problem with losing this consistency is that it changes what Stewie's relationship with Brian means. In the early framing where Brian was the only one who could truly understand Stewie, their friendship was unique and irreplaceable in a specific way. It was the only real connection Stewie had with another consciousness. Brian's ability to hear him was not just a communication convenience. It was the existential condition under which Stewie could be known at all. Once other characters can also hear Stewie, that specific quality of their relationship is diluted. Brian becomes one of several people who can communicate with Stewie rather than the only one. The friendship remains special, but for different reasons based on shared history and mutual affection rather than on a unique perceptual gift. This is a smaller and less extraordinary thing than what the early show was describing. There is also the matter of Peter Griffin's intelligence, which the show has handled with such variability that calling it inconsistent is almost an understatement. The show has established in a canonical episode that Peter is legally classified as mentally disabled. The episode Petarded puts him in a situation where his cognitive limitations are tested and confirmed by official standards. He cannot identify the color of a fire truck. He has trouble with elementary questions. He once forgot how to sit down. And yet Peter has also demonstrated in other episodes a level of functional competence that a person with the cognitive profile established in Petarded could not reasonably achieve. He has held complex jobs. He has navigated situations that required planning and coordination. He has had arguments sophisticated enough to constitute genuine debate. The show needs him to be catastrophically dim when the joke requires catastrophic dimness, and it needs him to be merely bumblingly ordinary when the joke requires only ordinary bumbling. The giant chicken is another mystery the show has built and then declined to explain. Ernie the giant chicken has appeared periodically across the show's run to engage Peter in extended, elaborate, destructive battles that function as pure spectacle, two characters fighting each other across escalating settings with no clear endpoint and no permanent consequences. These fights are some of the show's most beloved recurring bits. They are also deeply strange when examined from any angle other than pure enjoyment. Who is Ernie? The show has given glimpses: a wife, a social life, apparent goals and relationships outside his conflict with Peter. He is not simply a villain or a device. He is, within the world of the show, a person. A very large person who may or may not be a chicken in the conventional sense, but a person with a life and connections and presumably feelings about the periodic destruction of large portions of his surrounding environment. What is his relationship to mortality? He has died, or appeared to die, more than once across the series. And he always comes back. Always. Without explanation, and without the show acknowledging that his resurrection requires one, within a universe that treats death with as much flexibility as Family Guy does, this is perhaps not remarkable. But Ernie specifically seems to have a durability that even the show's generally elastic mortality cannot quite account for. And Peter matches him in this. Peter is also, functionally speaking, extremely difficult to kill. He has survived things that would not normally be survivable. The show does not explain why. It simply allows it, because Peter's survival is necessary for the show to continue. The accumulated effect of these broken rules is not primarily confusion, though confusion is part of it. The accumulated effect is an atmosphere, a sense that the world of this show is governed by principles that shift depending on what the current episode needs, that the rules are always provisional, that the universe bends around the requirements of each week's story without maintaining any fixed shape of its own. This atmosphere is both a feature and a bug. It gives the show enormous flexibility. It can do almost anything, try almost any genre, push almost any boundary, because it is not tethered to consistent rules that would limit it. But it also means that nothing the show does carries the weight that consistent world building would give it. Stakes only feel real in the moment. Consequences only stick when the show specifically decides they should. And the universe these characters inhabit is ultimately unknowable, in the way that a universe built on shifting rules is always unknowable, not because it is mysterious in an interesting way, but because it does not have stable enough foundations to be fully known. Section 13. What the show actually believes the deepest mystery of all. We have spent a long time in the dark with these mysteries. The gun in the vault, the name in the courtroom, the baby who created the universe, and the man who cannot be assigned a consistent age, the murder mystery that stayed permanent. The episode that tried to say something meaningful and said something else. The character whose entire history explains him in ways the show refuses to assemble into a coherent narrative. What we have been circling, throughout all of this, is the deepest question the show has ever posed, the one it has never answered directly and probably never will. Does Family Guy love its characters? This sounds soft. sentimental even. But it is actually one of the most precise and answerable questions you can ask about a long-running television show, because love in the specific sense of authorial investment, genuine care for the people you have created, shows up in concrete ways in the work itself. It shows up in whether characters are allowed to grow, whether their suffering serves a purpose beyond generating a reaction, whether the people making the show maintain a sense of responsibility toward who their characters were when the show began, and feel the weight of that responsibility through every season that follows. In its first 3 seasons, Family Guy appears to love its characters. The evidence is in the writing of those seasons. Peter's stupidity is balanced by genuine warmth. He is a fool who means well, and the warmth is real. His relationship with Lois has a tenderness that sits alongside the comedy without negating it. Brian's loneliness and his failed ambitions feel like real things, not props. Stewie's elaborate villainy is treated with fond appreciation for its own originality. Even Meg, in those early seasons, is given space to simply be a person, an overlooked, slightly boring teenager in an extraordinary family. But a person. Something changes in the years that follow, and the exact moment of change is hard to pin down, which is part of what makes it so difficult to discuss. It is not a single decision. It is accumulation. Peter becomes crueler, not in ways that connect to his backstory, but in ways that seem designed to push him further from the character he was, as if the writers were continuously testing how far they could go. Brian becomes more insufferable in a way that mirrors the writers' growing use of him as a vehicle for their own opinions, rather than a character with his own interiority. Stewie loses his distinctive identity. Meg becomes a target that the show enjoys in a way that begins to feel less like comedy and more like something else. The mysteries we have explored throughout this script are symptoms of this change. Each one of them represents a moment where the show had an opportunity to care about a character enough to follow through on something important, and chose not to. The Stan Thompson mystery is a mystery about whether the show is willing to look at Meg carefully enough to see the actual person beneath the punchline. The Gun in the Vault is a mystery about whether the show remembers that Brian Griffin has an interior life that includes real suffering. The Stewie paradox is a mystery about whether the show can hold the strangeness of what Stewie is without simplifying him into something easier to manage. Peter's shifting identity is a mystery about whether the show is willing to assemble the pieces of his history into something coherent enough to constitute a genuine character. In the moments when the show has chosen to care, when it has given these characters room to be fully realized and treated their pain as worth taking seriously, the results have been extraordinary. Brian and Stewie in the bank vault. No music, no cutaways, just 2 characters being honest with each other in the dark. And then there were fewer, tense and committed and willing to let its death stay dead. The scattered moments in the Meg storyline where the show briefly allows her to be more than a target, the Simpsons crossover, the episode about Peter's sister, the handful of later season moments where someone in the writing room apparently cared enough to give her an episode where she wins. These moments exist. They are genuinely good. They prove that the show is capable of the thing it most often declines to do. The mystery is why it so rarely chooses to do it. The answer, assembled from 25 seasons of evidence, is that Family Guy became something slightly different from what it was designed to be. It started as a comedy with characters at its center. Somewhere in the middle seasons, it became a comedy with jokes at its center, and the characters became the infrastructure that connected one joke to the next, rather than the reason the show existed. The cutaways went from a bonus to a crutch, and the crutch slowly drained the show of the character investment that had made the early seasons feel alive. And this shift had consequences for how the show handled the mysteries it had planted. When characters are the center, following through on their mysteries is essential, because the audience is invested in the characters, and the mysteries are about who those characters are. When jokes are the center, the mysteries become inconvenient. Following them would require slowing down, would require committing to a sustained emotional note, would require the audience to hold a complicated feeling rather than just laughing and moving on. So the mysteries stay open. Stan Thompson remains a name. The gun stays in the vault. Stewie's paradox remains unresolved. Peter's backstory remains unassembled. And the show continues, carrying these open questions with it into new seasons and new episodes and new nights when someone somewhere is watching a family in a Rhode Island town be terrible and wonderful and strange. The doors are all open. They have been open for years, and the cold air keeps coming through quietly underneath all the noise. These are the disturbing mysteries of Family Guy. Not jump scares and not gore and not the kind of darkness the show usually reaches for when it wants a reaction. Just questions that were asked and never answered, sitting in the mythology of a show that spent 25 years being too busy to sit with them. The gun is in the vault. Stan Thompson exists somewhere. Stewie made the universe. Quagmire was born in 1948. Diane Simmons is dead on a cliff. And somewhere in the sprawling, unruly, brilliant, frustrating mythology of a show that changed television and then kept going long after the changes settled somewhere, in all of that, the answers are waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. Sleep well. We will be back with more. And if you made it all the way here genuinely, from the bottom of everything, thank you. Please subscribe if you haven't. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means these videos keep existing for nights exactly like this one. Leave a comment with your favorite Family Guy mystery, or one I missed entirely, because there are always more doors in this show than any single script can open. Good night. Bonus Section 1. The missing characters' deaths and disappearances that Quahog forgot. One of the quietly disturbing things about Family Guy, when you take stock of it across its whole run, is how many characters have simply disappeared. Not died on screen in a memorable episode, not been written out with a farewell, but simply stopped appearing. Vanished from the town of Quahog as if they had never existed, and the show, as it always does, moved on without looking back. Muriel Goldman is the most significant of these, and her disappearance is at least partly explained. She was killed in And Then There Were Fewer, and the show committed to that death as permanent. Muriel, wife of the nervous and frequently panicked pharmacist Mort Goldman, had been a background presence in the show since its early seasons. She appeared in crowd scenes and neighborhood gatherings. She was part of the texture of the town. After And Then There Were Fewer, she is simply gone, and the show acknowledges this by her absence rather than by any extended discussion of what her death means to the remaining characters. What is notable about Muriel's disappearance is not that she died. It is that her death, the death of a character who had been present for years in a town that presumably has community rituals around grief, receives almost no sustained emotional treatment in the episodes that follow. Mort continues to appear. He continues to be anxious and nervous and a source of jokes, but the weight of having lost his wife, the specific texture that grief would give to a character who was already characterized by anxiety and fear, is never developed. It is simply a fact of the world now. Muriel is gone. Life continues. Diane Simmons is the other major death from that episode, and her absence has slightly more visible consequences because she was a more prominent recurring character, Tom Tucker's co-anchor, a figure with specific relationships and rivalries that shaped the show's version of local television. After her death, the Quahog news landscape is just different in ways the show occasionally acknowledges. But again, the death itself receives less sustained emotional attention than a person who was present in the community for years would conventionally receive. Then there are the characters who simply stopped appearing without explanation. People who were fixtures of early Quahog life and then gradually faded from view as the show went on. Some of these disappearances have practical explanations. Voice actors became unavailable, character dynamics became redundant as the show's ensemble shifted. Certain characters simply did not fit the directions the show was moving in. But from inside the universe of the show, these disappearances are unexplained. Cleveland Brown is a special case here. Cleveland was one of Peter's 4 core friends at the Drunken Clam in the early seasons, alongside Joe and Quagmire. He completed the group that defined Peter's social world outside the family. When Cleveland was given his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, he moved away from Quahog with his family and established a new life in Stool Bend, Virginia. His departure was treated as a genuine event. There was a farewell, a moving truck, a shift in the group dynamic at the Drunken Clam. The mystery is what happened afterward. Cleveland returned to Quahog after The Cleveland Show ended in 2013, and he has been a recurring presence in Family Guy again since then. But his return was handled with relatively little ceremony for someone who had been gone for 4 years, and the relationship between his absence, his new life, and his reintegration into the Quahog social world is treated with far less care than a real community returning member would receive. The mystery of missing characters is not really about any specific character's disappearance. It is about what the casual treatment of absences reveals about how the show thinks about its own world. In a real community, when someone dies or moves away, the people who remain are changed by the absence. The shape of every gathering is slightly different. The empty space at the table is felt. Family Guy is not a show that has ever been particularly interested in that kind of residual effect. Its universe does not accumulate absence in the way that real communities do. Spaces that were filled get filled again by the next thing, and the previous occupant simply recedes. This creates a world that, underneath the comedy, is slightly colder than it appears. A world where being forgotten is not a dramatic event but simply the natural outcome of time passing. Where significance is temporary and memory is short, and the town moves on from every loss with an efficiency that is almost eerie in how complete it is. The missing characters of Quahog are a mystery about what community means in this show's universe. And the answer, when you look at the evidence, is that community in Quahog means very little beyond immediate utility. The people who are useful to the current story are present. The people who are not simply are not there anymore, and nobody asks where they went. Bonus Section 2. Lois Griffin's actual history. The character the show never fully explored. Lois Griffin is the character the show has done least justice to across its entire run, and this is remarkable because she is the character with potentially the richest interior life of anyone in the cast. She is also the character whose backstory contains the most unexplored material, a history that the show has touched on repeatedly without ever doing the work of actually developing it. Start with the Pewter-Schmidt family. Lois comes from wealth, significant, old money wealth, the kind that has shaped not just the financial circumstances of her upbringing but the social world she was raised in, the expectations that were placed on her, and the specific kind of rebellion that choosing Peter Griffin as a husband represents. Carter Pewter-Schmidt, her father, is one of the show's recurring antagonists in a specific and interesting way. He represents everything that Lois walked away from when she chose Peter, and his contempt for Peter is always partly a contempt for the choice Lois made. What the show has never fully explored is what that choice actually felt like from the inside. Lois grew up wealthy, educated, expected to marry within a certain social class and live a certain kind of life. She chose differently. She chose a working-class man who is not particularly intelligent and whose behavior creates constant difficulty for everyone around him. The show treats this choice as a given. Lois loves Peter, Peter loves Lois, and the romantic foundation of the show depends on accepting this as true even when Peter's behavior makes it difficult to believe. But the choice itself, and what it meant to the person who made it, is something the show has never seriously examined. What did Lois give up? What did she expect her life to be? And how does the life she actually has compare to that expectation? What does she think about in the quiet moments that the show almost never gives her? There are glimpses scattered across the mythology. Early episodes show a Lois who plays piano beautifully and has a genuine artistic gift, a detail that gets mentioned occasionally but never developed. The show has established that Lois was a different person before Peter, or at least that she had access to a version of herself that was more independent and more fully realized as an individual. The episode where she briefly returns to modeling, or the episodes where she demonstrates capabilities that the ordinary demands of her household life have suppressed, suggest a woman with more range than her current circumstances allow her to express. There is also the mystery of the Stan Thompson connection, which we have already discussed as Meg's mystery, but which is equally Lois's mystery. Whatever happened between Lois and Stan Thompson took place at some point in Lois's life when she was making choices that she has subsequently kept secret. The choices were significant enough that they resulted in a pregnancy and a child. The secret has been kept for decades, and the keeping of it, the daily presence of Meg as a reminder of something Lois does not talk about, has shaped Lois's relationship with her oldest daughter in ways the show has acknowledged but never fully traced. The Lois of the later seasons is a significantly diminished version of the character. She becomes colder, more self-interested, more willing to participate in the cruelties directed at Meg and to look away from Peter's worst behavior. This gradual diminishment mirrors what happened to Peter, a character who started with genuine warmth and complexity, slowly stripped of those qualities as the show leaned harder on simpler, louder dynamics. But where Peter's Flanderization at least produced a character who was still the center of stories, Lois's diminishment often left her without stories of her own. She became a reactor rather than an agent, the person who responded to what Peter did, who commented on it, who was occasionally the victim of it, but who increasingly stopped being a character with her own desires and her own history and her own interior life. The mystery of Lois Griffin is the mystery of what the show chose not to do with its most potentially interesting character. The backstory is there, the wealth, the family, the choice she made, the secret she keeps, the piano she plays, and the life she might have led. The pieces of a genuinely compelling person are assembled and then set aside in favor of the simpler function she serves in the show's larger architecture. Who is Lois Griffin, actually? The show has the answer. It just never wanted to say it out loud. Bonus Section 3. The Drunken Clam and What It Represents: A Community of Broken Men. The Drunken Clam is Family Guy's version of the gathering place that every sitcom seems to require. The bar where the core group assembles, where the friendships that structure the social world of the show are maintained, where conversations happen that could not happen in any other setting. In Cheers, it was the titular bar. In How I Met Your Mother, it was McLaren's Pub. In Family Guy, it is the Drunken Clam, a working-class Rhode Island bar where Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, and, later, just Peter, Quagmire, and Joe, spend time that is framed as ordinary male friendship. But the Drunken Clam is also a location that, when examined carefully, reveals something genuinely dark about the characters who inhabit it. What happens at the Drunken Clam? Primarily, the men drink and they talk. They talk about their lives, their frustrations, their marriages, their various misadventures. They watch sports, they make plans. They are together in a way that is presented as comfortable and positive. This is where they want to be, with each other in this specific place. What is notable is how rarely the conversations at the Drunken Clam produce anything good. The plans hatched there almost always lead to disaster. The advice given by each man to the others is almost consistently terrible, not in an endearing way, but in a way that produces real harm to the people receiving it and to the people around them. Peter's bar conversations have launched schemes that endangered his family, cost him his job, and caused genuine damage to the community. The advice Quagmire and Joe and Cleveland have given Peter across 25 seasons has ranged from unhelpful to actively destructive. The Drunken Clam is a place where men who have not figured out their lives gather to perform confidence they do not have. Peter pretends to have his life under control. Quagmire performs the role of the uncomplicated pleasure seeker while carrying a history the show has revealed to be considerably more complicated. Joe navigates a disability that the show has sometimes treated with dignity and sometimes made the focus of jokes that undercut that dignity, and his friendships at the Clam exist alongside a marriage and a professional identity that are under constant pressure. Cleveland, when he is present, brings his own complicated history: a divorce, a relocation, a life rebuilt from significant wreckage. These are men who are, each in different ways, lost. And the Drunken Clam is the place where they gather to be lost together, which is perhaps the most honest thing the show could say about what male friendship sometimes looks like. The comfort of being with people who also have not worked things out, in a place where not having worked things out is accepted as the default condition. The mystery of the Drunken Clam is the mystery of what these men are actually to each other. The show frames their relationships as friendship: genuine, warm, durable friendship. And there is evidence to support this framing in the early seasons, when their interactions had warmth and care that felt real. But, as the seasons progressed, the dynamics at the Drunken Clam became more transactional and in some cases outright toxic. Peter has used these men poorly. He has asked things of them that genuine friends would not ask. He has taken and rarely given in return. What keeps them coming back? What makes Joe and Quagmire continue to show up at a table with a man who has, by any reasonable accounting, been a bad friend to them more often than a good one? The show's answer is simply that they are friends, and friends come back. But the question is worth sitting with, because the answer it actually suggests, if you look at the evidence rather than the framing, is that these men come back to the Drunken Clam because it is the only place in their lives where the version of themselves they are most comfortable with can exist. Not a better version, just a familiar one. Bonus Section 4. The Griffin House and its Architectural Mysteries. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street, Quahog, Rhode Island. This is stated consistently enough across the show's run to be treated as a fixed fact. The house is a two-story suburban home green exterior, reasonable size for a family of 5 plus a dog. It has a living room, a kitchen, a master bedroom, Chris's room, Meg's room, and Stewie's nursery, which doubles as a laboratory of extraordinary scope. Here is the mystery. Stewie's nursery contains a time machine, a return pad, a carbonite freeze gun, a laser gun, a weather control device, a mind control apparatus, and dozens of other pieces of advanced technology that he has built and maintained across the show's run. These are not small objects. The time machine alone, in its various depictions, is a substantial piece of equipment. The accumulated inventory of Stewie's weapons and devices, if stored together in a conventional nursery, would not fit. And yet the nursery fits them. Every time. Because the show needs it to. This is a small thing in isolation. It is the kind of spatial inconsistency that animated shows produce constantly, where the rules of physical space bend to accommodate whatever the story needs. But in a show that has built as much specific mythology around Stewie's inventory as Family Guy has, the question of where all of it actually goes, where it is stored, how it is maintained, how Lois changes the baby's sheets every week without encountering the kind of equipment that should fill the room to the ceiling becomes genuinely curious. There is a version of this mystery that actually has interesting implications. If Stewie's nursery is somehow larger on the inside than it appears from outside, if the same baby who created the universe has also, perhaps without particularly thinking about it, adjusted the spatial dimensions of his personal space to accommodate his needs, then the nursery is not just a room. It is something else. Something Stewie has shaped to suit himself, the way a being of sufficient capability might shape any aspect of his environment. This is probably reading far too much into an animated show's pragmatic decision to not worry about where Stewie keeps his stuff. But in a show where the mythology has grown large enough to sustain this level of scrutiny, the question at least deserves to be named. More substantively, the Griffin house has never aged. The neighborhood has never changed in any significant way. The show's floating timeline means that the physical world of the show is as frozen as its characters. 31 Spooner Street in 2025 looks essentially the same as it did in 1999. The same layout, the same furniture, the same texture. It is a house preserved in amber. What does it mean to live in a house that does not change? What does it feel like to inhabit a space that seems to exist outside of time in the same way the characters do? The show does not ask these questions because they are not the kind of questions it was built to ask. But they are part of the atmosphere of the show's universe, the quality that makes Quahog feel slightly off-kilter, slightly uncanny, in a way that the comedy rarely directly addresses. The house on Spooner Street is one of the great preserved objects of American television mythology, and the mystery of what lives inside it, truly inside it, in all its accumulated history and unsaid things, that mystery is as old as the show itself. Bonus Section 5. What Stewie Saw in Lois, the Psychology of the First Villain. We have spent a significant amount of time discussing Stewie's transformation from evil genius to softer, emotionally available character. What we have not spent much time on is the specific, original reason for Stewie's hatred of Lois. A reason the show stated explicitly in the early seasons and then quietly walked away from as the character evolved. Stewie's explanation, when he bothered to give one, was that he harbored a deep resentment of the 9 months he spent in what he characterized as Lois's ovarian bastille. This was the show's comedic frame for his motivation, a prenatal resentment that manifested as a full-scale homicidal campaign against the woman, who had, from Stewie's perspective, imprisoned him without consent for the better part of a year. This is funny. It is also, when you look at it carefully, a genuinely interesting psychological construct. A being of extraordinary intelligence, confined before he could express that intelligence or use it to affect his environment, who emerged from that confinement with a permanent fixation on the person he associates with the imprisonment. The fury of the early Stewie toward Lois is not random, and it is not purely comedic. It is, within the logic of the character, a response to a specific and deeply felt grievance. What the show never explored is what the relationship between Stewie and Lois would look like if that grievance were properly examined. The early show had Lois as the oblivious target of Stewie's campaign. She never knew he wanted her dead, never understood the nature of their relationship from his perspective. The dramatic irony of this was central to the comedy, but it also meant that the relationship between them was never actually addressed. Stewie had elaborate feelings about Lois. Lois had no idea he had any feelings at all beyond the ordinary neediness of a 1-year-old. As the character evolved and the hostility toward Lois faded, this dynamic was simply set aside without resolution. Stewie stopped wanting to kill Lois. The relationship shifted towards something warmer, more ordinary, more like a conventional mother-son dynamic filtered through the show's comedic register. But the grievance that drove the original character was never addressed. Lois never learned what she had been to Stewie. Stewie never had the confrontation that his original motivation implied he needed. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie appeared to offer this resolution. Stewie finally acting on his campaign, Lois finally seeing her son as what he actually was. But the simulation twist removed the consequence, and the confrontation that happened in the simulation was not experienced as real by anyone but Stewie. What would it look like for Stewie and Lois to have a genuine conversation about who they are to each other? Not in the simulation, not in a cutaway, but in the actual reality of the show's universe? The original Stewie had things he wanted to say to his mother that he never got to say, because the campaign never succeeded and the character evolved away from the motivation before a genuine confrontation was possible. This is the most intimate of the Stewie mysteries. The baby who hated his mother most completely was also the baby who, in the later seasons, is shown loving her enough to save her life. What happened in the space between those two versions of the same relationship? The show does not say, "It is another door in the dark, with cold air coming through." Bonus. Section 6. Family Guy's relationship with death, a mythology of impermanence. We have talked about individual deaths in this show, Brian's death and return, the permanent deaths of And Then There Were Fewer, the question of whether anything in Quahog is truly permanent. But it is worth stepping back and looking at the show's relationship with death as a whole, because it reveals something about the show's deepest beliefs about consequence and meaning. Death in Family Guy is an inconsistent thing. Characters die regularly in cutaway gags, in one-off scenes, in episodes that occasionally take the deaths seriously and more often treat them as incidental. Background characters die constantly. The show has killed more nameless extras than can be easily counted. These deaths are played for laughs and are forgotten immediately. They happen in a universe where the rules of mortality are treated as flexible when the joke requires flexibility. But occasionally death becomes something the show actually means. The deaths in And Then There Were Fewer, as we discussed, stayed permanent. The death of Francis Griffin, Peter's cold and demanding stepfather, was also treated as genuine and permanent. The episode dealing with his death, Holy Crap from Season 2, is actually one of the more emotionally effective early episodes, precisely because it takes the death of a father figure seriously rather than using it as a punchline. What is the difference between the deaths that stick and the deaths that do not? The clearest answer is narrative intent. When the show decided in advance that a death was meant to matter, the show committed to it. When deaths happened as collateral damage or as one-off jokes, they were forgotten. But this creates an interesting asymmetry in the mythology. The citizens of Quahog live in a world where death is selective in its permanence. Some people die and stay dead. Others die in one episode and appear unharmed in the next. The universe applies the rules of mortality differently depending on what the story needs, and the characters themselves, if they were capable of the kind of sustained reflection that would allow them to notice, this would have good reason to find the arbitrariness of it profoundly unsettling. There is a Family Guy episode that directly addresses death as a character. Death is a Bitch from Season 2. In this episode, the personification of death visits the Griffin household after Peter technically dies. Death injures himself on a skateboard and is laid up, unable to work. While he is incapacitated, no one can die, and Peter takes advantage of this by engaging in increasingly reckless behavior. The episode establishes, as a canonical fact of the Family Guy universe, that death is personal. It is individual. There is a being whose specific job it is to collect souls, and when that being is unable to do his job, people who should die do not. The universe has a mechanism for death, and that mechanism can be disrupted. This means that every death in the show occurs because death showed up and collected the soul. Every death that does not occur, every survival that defies probability is either death not having shown up yet or death having been somehow occupied elsewhere. Brian's car accident, in this framing, is an event where death did show up. Brian's death was real and permanent within the show's rules. Not because the show decided to be brave about consequences, but because death came for him and did the job. Stewie's time travel intervention prevented death from doing that job by changing the circumstances of the afternoon itself, by changing the street hockey game, so that Brian was not in the car's path. Stewie ensured that death never had occasion to come. The timeline was changed before death arrived, not after. This is a coherent reading of the time travel logic, and it makes Brian's resurrection feel slightly less like a cheat if you adopt it. But it also raises a question about all the other near deaths in the show, all the times Peter has survived things that should have killed him, all the times characters have walked away from situations that death should have been collecting from. Was death simply not there for those? Did someone intervene? Or does the show simply not care about the consistency of its own mortality rules enough to account for every case? The mystery of death in Family Guy is ultimately the mystery of what the show believes about the weight of loss. When it chooses to make a death permanent, it is saying that this loss matters, that the shape of the world has genuinely changed, that something that existed will not exist again. When it allows deaths to be reversed or forgotten, it is saying the opposite, that the world is elastic enough to accommodate the loss without really being changed by it. Most of the time, Family Guy believes the latter. Most of the time, the world snaps back. But in those specific moments when it commits to permanence, when it says this one stays, this one matters, the show reveals that it knows the difference between meaningful loss and spectacle, even when it usually chooses spectacle. Those are the deaths that haunt. Not the ones that were reversed, but the ones that were not. Muriel Goldman is still gone from Quahog. Diane Simmons is still on the cliff. Some doors, once closed, stay closed. Closing thoughts. The show that knows more than it says. There is something important that gets lost when Family Guy is discussed primarily as a comedy about shock value and cutaway gags. Something that the show's best episodes, scattered across 25 seasons like islands in a generally noisy sea, keep demonstrating is real. Family Guy knows things about its own characters that it almost never says out loud. It knows that Meg Griffin is carrying a secret about her own identity that would change everything she understands about her family. It knows that Brian Griffin has made preparations that go beyond the daily disappointments that his normal behavior suggests. It knows that Stewie Griffin is both a child and something else, something considerably larger and stranger than the infant body he inhabits. It knows that Quagmire is more than the joke his exterior presents. It knows that Peter has a history that explains him in ways his behavior makes it easy to miss. The show built all of this. The writers who planted these seeds across different seasons, in different writers' rooms, with different levels of coordination, chose to put these things into the mythology. They chose to reveal Meg's biological father in a courtroom scene. They chose to show Brian's gun in a bank vault. They chose to have Stewie create the universe. They chose to give Quagmire a birth date that raises questions nobody has answered. These were not accidents. They were choices. Choices about what kind of show this was, or what kind of show it could be. Choices about depth. The mystery is why those choices were not followed through on more consistently. Why the show that revealed Brian's secret kept that secret to a single episode, rather than letting it reshape what we understood about the character. Why the Stan Thompson revelation sat in the mythology for years before anyone tried to do something with it. Why Stewie's paradox, the revelation that he created the universe, was played for a single laugh and then filed away. The answer, assembled across everything we have discussed tonight, is probably not that the show did not care. It probably cared, at the moment of each revelation, genuinely. But caring in a moment and sustaining that care across the architecture of a long-running television show are different skills. Family Guy excelled at the former and struggled persistently with the latter. The doors it opened are still open. The cold air is still coming through. And the mysteries, the real ones, the ones that live in the mythology and cast shadows across everything else, are still waiting for the attention they were promised when they were first introduced. They are, in a strange way, the most faithful elements of the show. They have not moved. They have not been undone or retconned or resolved into something easier. They are simply there, exactly where they were left, exactly as strange as they were on the day they first appeared. The gun is in the vault. The name is in the courtroom. The baby made the universe. The old man does not look his age. And somewhere in the quiet mythology of a show that has been loud for 25 years, the answers are still there, waiting to be said. They have been waiting a long time. If you made it all the way to the end of this, thank you, truly. Drop a comment with where you are and what time it is, because knowing someone is out there in the dark makes this worth it. Please subscribe if you have not yet. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it is the most direct way to make sure these videos keep being made. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one. Extended Deep Dive. The complete mythology of Stewie's weapons and why their disappearance matters. Let us spend some more time with Stewie, because the mystery of his weapons inventory is one that rewards closer examination. The gradual disappearance of his arsenal, not through any in-universe explanation, but simply through the show losing interest in it, is one of the clearest examples of how Family Guy builds mythology without a plan for maintaining it. In the very first episode of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow, which premiered on the 31st of January 1999, Stewie is already established as a character with advanced technological capabilities. The show does not introduce him slowly. It does not ease the audience into the concept of a genius baby. It simply shows him attempting to manipulate the weather to destroy broccoli crops globally, because broccoli is a vegetable he dislikes, and global agricultural destruction is a proportionate response to an unwanted vegetable in the mind of this particular infant. This sets the register immediately and perfectly. Stewie does not think small. His responses are not calibrated to the actual scale of the problem he is responding to. If he dislikes something, his solution is elimination at the largest possible scale. If he wants something, he builds the technology to achieve it, regardless of how extraordinarily complicated that technology needs to be. The weather device is just the beginning. Across the first 3 seasons, Stewie constructs and deploys a catalog of weapons and tools that would be extraordinary even in the hands of a fully equipped research institution, let alone in the bedroom of a 1-year-old in a suburban Rhode Island household. The time machine, which moves time forward in its first use, not backward, which is an important distinction the show later ignores, is introduced in Season 1. It is a substantial piece of equipment initially, requiring physical space and power infrastructure that Stewie somehow manages to conceal from everyone in the house. The carbonite freeze gun is deployed against a security guard who stands in Stewie's way in the Season 1 episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang. The guard is frozen for approximately 10 years, which the show treats as a casual detail. Somewhere in Quahog, a man spent a decade frozen solid because a baby found him inconvenient. And when the freeze wore off, the man presumably had some very difficult questions about what had happened to his life. The show does not follow up on this. The guard simply disappears from the narrative after his initial appearance. The microship, a battlecruiser shrunk to cellular scale, appears in the episode Mission Impossible when Stewie needs to prevent Lois and Peter from having another child. This is a device of genuinely extraordinary engineering. Stewie not only built a functional battlecruiser, but developed the technology to reduce it to microscopic scale while maintaining its operational capability. He then navigated it through a human body and engaged in combat with Peter's sperm. This is simultaneously one of the most absurd things the show has ever done, and one of the most impressive demonstrations of Stewie's capabilities. And after the episode ends, the microchip is never mentioned again. The hypnosis device, capable of controlling the public at large, appears in Brian Does Hollywood. The mind control device, calibrated to harness Chris's size and strength, appears in the story on page 1. The mass control apparatus surfaces in various forms across the first 3 seasons, each time with enough specificity that the show is clearly taking the concept of Stewie's capabilities seriously rather than treating them as throwaway details. What happened to all of this technology? The most honest answer is, the writers stopped writing about it. As Stewie's character shifted away from the evil genius persona toward the more emotionally available version that emerged after the show's return from cancellation, the weapons became inconvenient. They were part of a version of Stewie that the show was consciously moving away from. Writing new weapons required writing new schemes, and new schemes required the show to commit to the evil genius character in a way it had decided not to do anymore. So the weapons simply stopped appearing with regularity. They show up occasionally as background props or as callbacks to who Stewie used to be. He might reference the time machine or produce a laser in a scene where the show is invoking the early season Stewie. But the sustained inventory, the sense that behind the nursery door was a fully equipped laboratory of extraordinary scope, quietly dissolved. Within the universe of the show, this creates a mystery about what actually happened to all of it. Stewie did not dismantle his arsenal. There is no episode in which he clears out the nursery. The time machine is still there. It is used in Season 12 and beyond. The other devices presumably still exist somewhere, but the show no longer cares about them, so they are invisible. This is a metaphor that is worth sitting with. A being who built extraordinary things, who accumulated a catalog of capability across years of disciplined work, who had tools that could have given him genuine power over the world around him, and who then simply stopped using them. Not because they stopped working, not because he decided they were wrong, but because he moved on. The weapons are there. in some nursery closet, in some version of the show's universe, gathering metaphorical dust, waiting for a version of Stewie who is no longer coming back to pick them up. Extended deep dive. The Quagmire-Brian feud, a mirror for the show's own contradictions. In the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers a speech to Brian that has become one of the most discussed scenes in Family Guy's history. The speech, which runs for several minutes of the episode's runtime, is a precise and comprehensive inventory of everything Brian has done wrong, every hypocrisy, every failure, every way in which the dog who presents himself as the most intelligent and morally aware person in any room is in fact a fraud. Quagmire tells Brian that he hits on Lois despite Peter paying for his food and having saved his life. He tells Brian that his writing career is a failure. He tells Brian that he pretends to be an intellectual but is in fact not as smart as he thinks he is. He tells Brian that he abandoned his own son. He tells Brian that despite presenting himself as morally superior to everyone around him, his actual behavior is worse than most of theirs. He tells Brian that he finds him insufferable, and that if he were not Peter's friend, he would have nothing to do with him. And then the speech is over, and the episode continues. And Brian, in the episodes that follow, changes nothing about his behavior. The speech that was clearly intended to function as some kind of catharsis, both for Quagmire and for the frustrated segment of the audience who had been feeling exactly what Quagmire was saying, produced no actual change in the character it was addressed to. The mystery of the Quagmire-Brian feud is the mystery of why the show built a confrontation it did not intend to act on. The speech was a gift to the audience, acknowledgement that they were right, that Brian had become insufferable, that someone in the show's own universe could see what was happening and name it clearly. It was the show's way of saying, we know. We know Brian has become this. We know it is not what he was. But knowing and doing something about it are different things. After the Quagmire speech, the show had an opportunity. Brian could have undergone a genuine change, not a complete personality reversal, but some meaningful evolution in response to having been so accurately seen and called out. The show has demonstrated, in scattered episodes across its history, that it knows how to write character development when it wants to. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode is proof of this. The show can slow down and let a character be genuinely changed by an experience. It chose not to do that with the Quagmire speech. It chose to have Brian react with hostility and wounded pride, and then to continue being exactly what he had been. The speech became a historical event in the mythology, something that happened, that people remember, that is sometimes referenced but not a turning point. Not a door that led somewhere. The feud between Quagmire and Brian that developed after Jerome is the New Black became one of the show's recurring dynamics in later seasons, with the two characters periodically entering into escalating conflicts that were played primarily for comedy. Brian would do something to antagonize Quagmire. Quagmire would retaliate. The episode would reach its point of maximum conflict and then resolve, usually by returning to a baseline where the feud was ongoing but not actively destructive. What the feud never did, and this is the mystery at its heart, was acknowledge the asymmetry that the Quagmire speech established. Quagmire's grievances against Brian, as articulated in that speech, were legitimate. They were backed by evidence. They were true things that the show itself had depicted. Brian's grievances against Quagmire, when he had them, were largely complaints about Quagmire's interference with things Brian was doing that he should not have been doing. So the feud was not between two equally matched parties with equally legitimate grievances. It was between a character who had been correctly identified as a hypocrite and a fraud and the character who correctly identified him. And yet the show treated their conflict as a symmetrical, ongoing battle rather than as a situation with a clear moral architecture. This is characteristic of how Family Guy handles moral complexity in general. The show can see it, it can articulate it, and then it smooths it out into something more comfortable, a conflict between characters rather than an honest accounting of who is actually in the wrong. The Quagmire-Brian feud is a mystery about honesty, about what it means to say a true thing in a story and then not follow the truth to its consequences. The speech was honest. Everything after it was a retreat from that honesty. Extended deep dive. The show's relationship with consequence, a study in strategic memory. One of the most consistent and most discussed qualities of Family Guy across its long run is its relationship with consequence. Specifically, the show's habit of resetting between episodes, of allowing characters to have profound experiences in one episode and then appear entirely unchanged in the next, of treating its own mythology as optional rather than mandatory. This habit is not unique to Family Guy. Many long-running animated series operate on what critics call the episodic reset, the understanding that by the time the next episode airs, the previous one's consequences will have been erased, and the characters will return to their default configurations. The Simpsons pioneered this approach in American animated television, and Family Guy adopted it as a structural feature, rather than trying to build the kind of sustained continuity that serialized drama requires. But Family Guy's use of the episodic reset is notable for how aggressively it applies the reset even to episodes that seemed, in their own terms, to be demanding something more permanent. The Vault episode Brian's Gun, his honesty about what it is for, demanded a different Brian afterward. The Peter's Sister episode, the revelation about the abuse cycle, the reconciliation between Peter and Meg, demanded a different dynamic in the house afterward. The And Then There Were Fewer episode, the permanent deaths, the revelation of Stewie as someone who will take a life to protect his mother, demanded a different understanding of these characters going forward. None of these demands were met. The reset happened every time. The next episode arrived with the characters at their default configurations, carrying none of the specific weight the previous episode had placed on them. What this accumulated pattern tells us about the show is something the show has occasionally acknowledged directly through its own fourth-wall-breaking humor. The characters in Family Guy know they are in a television show. They occasionally reference their own status as animated characters. Peter has addressed the audience directly. Stewie has made meta-comments about the show's quality declining. The show has a self-awareness about its own nature that it wears lightly as a comedic feature. But self-awareness is not the same as accountability. The show can acknowledge that it resets without actually changing the fact that it resets. And the audience, conditioned after enough seasons to expect the reset, adjust their expectations accordingly. They stop expecting consequences to persist. They watch each episode as a discrete experience, rather than as part of an accumulated narrative. The mystery this produces is a philosophical one. What do the characters in this show actually experience? If Brian's moment in the vault is forgotten by the time the next episode begins, did it happen from Brian's perspective? If Peter and Meg's reconciliation is erased by the reset, was the emotion in that moment real? If Stewie's revelation that he created the universe produces no lasting change in how he understands himself, what does the revelation actually mean? These questions are probably unanswerable within the framework of the show's own mythology, because the mythology was not designed to answer them. The show's strategic memory, its habit of remembering what is useful and forgetting what is inconvenient, means that the answers to these questions are whatever the current episode needs them to be. But the questions are still there. They sit in the mythology alongside all the other mysteries we have discussed, in the dark, waiting for a version of the show that will finally sit still long enough to look at them. That version of the show has never come. After 25 seasons, it seems unlikely to. But the questions remain, which is its own kind of answer. The things a show refuses to face are often the most revealing things about what it believes. Final reflection. What Family Guy built without meaning to. We are at the end of tonight's journey. We have looked at the mysteries one by one, held them up to the light, tried to understand what they are made of and why they matter. And what I want to leave you with is not an explanation we have established clearly that most of these mysteries will not be explained, that the show has had 25 years to answer its own questions, and has mostly chosen not to but a reframing. Family Guy is often described as a show that does not care about its own mythology, that treats its characters as interchangeable and its history as optional. That produces a mythology of disconnected moments rather than an accumulated narrative. And this description is not wrong. It is accurate to a significant portion of what the show is and how it operates. But it misses something that the show's best moments, and we have visited a number of them tonight, consistently demonstrate. Family Guy built something it did not fully intend to build. In the process of producing hundreds of episodes of a comedy about a loudly idiotic family, it accumulated a mythology that contains genuine depth, real darkness, real questions about identity and consequence, and what it means to love imperfect people in an imperfect world. The mysteries we have discussed are not evidence of a show that was too lazy or too careless to tie up its loose ends. They are evidence of a show that, at various points and through the work of various writers, reached for something more complicated than comedy and touched it, felt it, and then, more often than not, pulled back. The gun in the vault is real. The Stan Thompson mystery is real. Stewie's paradox is real. These are genuine things that the show put into its own universe, with genuine care, at genuine cost to the easier version of the story it might have told instead. And then they were left. Not erased, not resolved, left. The doors the show opened are still open. The cold air is still coming through. And the most disturbing thing about Family Guy's mysteries is not what they reveal about the characters, or even about the show. It is what they reveal about storytelling itself, about how easy it is to ask a question and how hard it is to sit with the answer. About how stories that build real mythology often do so by accident, in the gaps between the things they were actually trying to say, and then do not know what to do with what they have built. Family Guy built something worth examining. This script has been an attempt to examine it. And if you have been here for all of it, through all the quiet sections and the dark corners and the long pauses over the mysteries that the show chose not to solve, thank you. Genuinely. The show will keep going. The questions will stay open. The doors will stay ajar. Some things deserve to stay a mystery. Sleep well. Additional section. The complete history of the Griffin family tree secrets hidden in ancestry. One of the most consistently interesting and most consistently ignored corners of Family Guy's mythology is the Griffin family tree, which extends backward through history in ways the show introduced across several episodes and then never assembled into a coherent picture. The most significant historical Griffin is Nate Griffin, a black man who was enslaved in the 19th century and who is established in the show as one of Peter's ancestors. This revelation appears in the episode Peter's Ancestor, and it has a specific and interesting implication for Peter Griffin's self-understanding. A man who has sometimes displayed racist attitudes has ancestry that should, if he were paying attention, complicate those attitudes significantly. The show acknowledges this irony without fully developing it, which is characteristic of how Family Guy handles its most interesting material. There is also the matter of Peter's Irish heritage through Mickey McFinnigan, his biological father. The Irish lineage, combined with the Mexican birthplace and the African ancestry through Nate Griffin, makes Peter Griffin one of the most ethnically complex main characters in animated television. Not in the sense that the show has done anything interesting with this complexity, but in the sense that the information is there, in the mythology, waiting to mean something. The Griffin family has also apparently intersected with several significant moments in American history, usually through quick cutaways that establish an ancestor doing something notable in a historical context. These cutaways are played for comedy. The joke is usually that a Griffin relative was involved in a historical event in a way that is embarrassing or counterproductive. But they accumulate into a suggestion that the Griffin lineage runs deeper and stranger than the suburban Rhode Island life Peter currently inhabits suggests. What is the actual history of the Griffins? Where did they come from, in the fullest sense? The show has given us pieces across 25 years, an Irish father, a Mexican birthplace, African ancestry, a stepfather whose religious conservatism shaped Peter's childhood, a sister who was abusive, a grandmother who appears occasionally, but it has never assembled these into anything approaching a complete picture. The Griffin family tree is a mystery that the show grew by accident, by adding individual branches over the years without ever looking at the shape of the whole. The result is a tree that, if you drew it out, would look stranger than any of the individual branches suggest on their own. A family connected to an enslaved man, to an Irish wanderer, to a Mexican town where someone tried and failed to prevent their existence, to a cold New England stepfather, to a sister who passed down abuse. This family has a history that would make for extraordinary television if anyone chose to actually tell it. No one has chosen to. Additional section, the town of Quahog, what lies beneath the comedy. Quahog, Rhode Island is the fictional town at the center of Family Guy's universe, and it is in many ways the most interesting and most underexplored setting in the show's mythology. Not because the show has been ungenerous with Quahog's geography. The town has a newspaper, a police department, a local news station, a bar, a church, a hospital, and various other institutions that the show draws on regularly. But because the town as an entity is considerably stranger than the show typically acknowledges, consider what Quahog has experienced across 25 seasons of Family Guy. It has been the site of multiple murders, including the events of And Then There Were Fewer, in which several of its residents were killed in a single evening at a mansion outside town. It has been partially destroyed on multiple occasions, usually collateral damage from the fight between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken. It has experienced a period when death was incapacitated and no one could die, which had cosmic implications that the town barely noticed. It has been subjected to Stewie's weather machine, various experiments from Stewie's laboratory, time distortions caused by misuse of the time machine, and numerous other events that in a realistic world would constitute significant traumas. The residents of Quahog have absorbed all of this with the cheerful resilience that fictional small towns in comedies are expected to display. No one in Quahog shows lasting psychological effects from the town's repeated encounters with extraordinary and often violent events. The community does not have a collective memory that anyone draws on. The next episode begins with the town in its default configuration, as if the previous episode's chaos had simply not occurred. But occasionally the show allows a glimpse of something different. The citizens of Quahog, in And Then There Were Fewer, demonstrate genuine fear when they realize they are trapped with a killer. The fear is real and sustained across the episode, not played for comedy in the way that danger usually is in Family Guy. For that 1 hour, Quahog is a real place where real danger can happen to real people. These glimpses are rare, but they suggest that beneath the comedy town surface of Quahog, beneath the cheerful amnesia that allows the show to reset after every disaster, there is something that could be more. A town with a genuine history of extraordinary events, with residents who have collectively experienced things that no ordinary small town should experience, and who have somehow found ways to continue functioning in the face of all of it. What would Quahog look like if the show ever chose to look at it directly? If the accumulated history of the town, the murders, the disasters, the encounters with death and with time travel, and with a baby who accidentally created the universe were examined rather than erased? The show does not want to know. It needs Quahog to be a clean slate, ready to absorb whatever the current episode requires of it. But the question of what the town has actually experienced, and what that experience has done to the people who live there, is one of the genuinely interesting mysteries in a show full of genuinely interesting mysteries. Additional section. The Road to Episodes: A Parallel Mythology. Running alongside the main mythology of Family Guy, with its Griffin family drama and its Quahog-based adventures, is a parallel mythology that the show has built through its Road to Episodes, special adventure stories featuring Brian and Stewie traveling together to unusual locations. These episodes form their own coherent subseries within the larger show, with their own conventions, their own emotional register, and their own accumulating history. And they contain mysteries that are distinct from the mysteries of the main show, mysteries that arise specifically from the particular dynamic of Brian and Stewie in an adventure context. The Road to Episodes began in the show's third season with Road to Rhode Island, in which Brian and Stewie travel across the country together after Stewie misses a connecting flight. The episode established the template: 2 mismatched characters, a journey, genuine connection amid the comedy, and usually a musical number that the show used to express something that the characters could not say in dialogue. The musical numbers in the Road to Episodes are themselves a kind of mystery. Brian and Stewie, who in the main show do not burst into song, become effortlessly theatrical in the Road to context. The songs they perform are often surprisingly emotionally resonant, capable of carrying genuine feeling in ways that the regular episode format rarely allows. The musical numbers in these episodes sometimes say things about the characters' relationship that the dialogue does not directly state, and the gap between what the songs express and what the characters acknowledge in words is its own kind of revealing. The Road to Germany episode in Season 7 is the darkest entry in the subseries and one of the darkest episodes in the show's history. Brian, Stewie, and Mort Goldman accidentally travel to 1939 Germany, where the Nazi regime is in full operation. The episode is played primarily for comedy, but with a genuine undercurrent of menace. The danger is real, the historical context is not soft-pedaled, and the way the episode uses Mort's Jewish identity in the specific context of a Nazi Germany story creates a tonal complexity that the show's usual approach would not typically allow. What is the mystery of the Road to Episodes? It is the mystery of what happens to these characters when they are away from the main show's mythology. The Brian and Stewie who travel together, who navigate historical Germany, who get lost in Las Vegas, who end up outside the space-time continuum, who face genuine danger and genuine vulnerability together, are different from the Brian and Stewie of the regular episodes. More honest, more willing to say what they actually feel, more capable of growth, of change, of being moved by what happens to them. Why are they different in these contexts? The answer is partly that the Road to format allows for sustained character focus in a way that the regular episode structure does not. When Brian and Stewie are the only significant characters in an episode, the show cannot hide behind cutaways or ensemble gags. It has to put the relationship front and center and trust that the relationship is interesting enough to sustain a full episode's attention. And it is. The mystery of why these characters work so well together, why the Road to episodes consistently produce some of the show's best material, is the mystery of what the show could have been if it had committed fully to character-driven storytelling rather than treating character as the scaffolding between jokes. The Road to episodes are proof that Family Guy can do something it almost never commits to doing. They are, in their own quiet way, the most honest parts of the show. Additional section: the show's self-awareness, what it means to know your own decline. One of the most unusual qualities of Family Guy in its later seasons is its willingness to acknowledge its own decline. Characters break the fourth wall to comment on the show's quality. The writers insert jokes about the show being on too long, about the jokes being lazy, about the audience having stopped watching. The show performs a kind of self-awareness that is genuinely unusual in television, a show openly discussing its own problems from the inside. This is interesting as a cultural artifact. It is also, when examined carefully, a mystery. Because what does it mean for a show to know it has declined, and continue declining anyway? The most generous reading is that the self-aware jokes are genuine humility, an acknowledgement that the people making the show know things have changed, that they remember what the show was, and that they are doing what they can within the constraints of a production that has run very long under difficult conditions. The jokes about quality are a form of honesty, of not pretending that everything is fine when clearly not everything is fine. The less generous reading is that the self-awareness is a form of preemptive defense. By acknowledging the problems before anyone can point them out, the show protects itself from criticism. If the show already knows it is lazy or repetitive or has gone on too long, then pointing out that it is lazy or repetitive or has gone on too long becomes redundant. The acknowledgement disarms the critique. The mystery is which of these is actually true, and the answer is probably that it is both simultaneously. Shows and the people who make them can be genuinely self-aware and defensively self-aware at the same time. The humor about declining quality can be honest and protective in the same breath. But here is the question that the self-awareness raises without answering. If you know the show has problems, and you have the platform to acknowledge those problems publicly through the show itself, why does that knowledge not produce change? If the writers who insert jokes about the show being lazy are also the writers who produce the lazy content those jokes refer to, what is happening in the space between the knowledge and the execution? This is the deepest form of the show's mystery about consequence. It is not just that the characters do not learn from their experiences, it is that the show itself does not learn from its own self-examination. The self-aware jokes about quality are a form of learning. They require someone to look at the show clearly enough to identify what is wrong with it. And then the next episode is produced in the same way as the one that prompted the self-aware joke, and the cycle continues. The show knows what it is. It has always known. The mystery is what knowing is worth when it does not produce change. Additional section: the emotional legacy of the show, what it left behind. We have reached the outermost layer of tonight's exploration. We have gone through the specific mysteries, the individual questions, and unanswered things that the show planted and left open. We have looked at the patterns that connect those mysteries, the show's relationship to consequence, to character, to its own mythology. And now we arrive at something more diffuse and more personal. What did Family Guy actually do to the people who watched it for 25 years? This is not a question with a clean answer. People who have watched a show since childhood and into adulthood carry it differently than people who discovered it later. The show that was playing in your living room when you were 12 is not the same as the show that plays now, not because the episodes have changed, but because you have. The Griffin family you knew then is preserved somewhere in your memory, in the form they took when you first met them. The Peter of your childhood relationship with the show is not the Peter of the later seasons. You keep both versions, the early and the late, and the gap between them is its own kind of loss. Family Guy gave people things they did not necessarily expect from a cartoon. It gave them Stewie, the most purely original animated character of his era, a being who occupied a space nothing else in television occupied, who made people feel like something genuinely new was possible in a medium that had started to feel settled and predictable. It gave them Brian and Stewie's friendship, which at its best communicated something true about what it means to be known by someone, really known, in a world that mostly sees your surface. It gave them Meg's suffering, which at its worst was cruelty and at its best was the show's most honest portrait of what it feels like to be overlooked. It gave them mysteries, open doors, questions without answers, the particular pleasure and discomfort of a story that trusts you to live with ambiguity, even if, in Family Guy's case, that trust was less intentional than it appears and more the result of a show that could not always follow its own threads. The emotional legacy of Family Guy is the legacy of any long-running story, complicated, mixed, deeply personal, and impossible to fully account for from the outside. The people who love this show love it for reasons that are specific to them, rooted in moments and episodes and lines of dialogue that landed in ways the writers could not have predicted and the show itself cannot fully control. The mysteries we have explored tonight are part of that legacy. They are the parts of the show that got left open and stayed open, that have been sitting in people's memories for years, that occasionally surface in late-night conversations about what the show meant and what it might have been. They are the parts that prove the show built something worth caring about, even if it did not always know how to care for what it built. The gun is in the vault. Stan Thompson exists in the mythology. Stewie made the universe. And somewhere, in the accumulated strange mythology of one of the most unusual shows in American television history, the answers to these questions are still waiting. They have been patient. They can wait a little longer. Thank you for listening. This has been a long one, and I am genuinely grateful to every person who made it all the way here. Drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. Those comments mean something, and I read them. Subscribe if you have not, and share this with someone who will appreciate it. Sleep well. See you in the next one. Deep Dive. The Griffin Children and what the show did with them. Of all the dimensions of the Family Guy mythology that deserve sustained attention, the treatment of the three Griffin children across the show's run is among the most revealing. Chris, Meg, and Stewie each began with a clear and specific character concept, and each had a relationship to their own potential that the show handled in very different ways as the seasons accumulated. We have spent considerable time with Stewie's transformation and with Meg's suffering. Chris Griffin deserves his own examination, because Chris is the quietest of the three mysteries, the one nobody talks about much, the one that gets overlooked in favor of the more dramatic arcs on either side of him. And that very quality of being overlooked is, itself, a key part of the mystery. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Chris Griffin served a specific and somewhat unusual comedic function. He was presented as the dim but sweet middle child, a boy who was awkward and socially uncertain, who made bad decisions for simple reasons, who was genuinely confused about most of what was happening around him but retained a fundamental sweetness that made him likable despite his evident limitations. He was not as spectacularly stupid as Peter. He was not as spectacularly capable as Stewie. He existed in a comfortable middle register, a normal kind of kid in an abnormal family. What made early Chris genuinely interesting was the occasional hint that, underneath the awkwardness and the confusion, there was something that the show was not fully developing. In a number of early episodes, Chris is shown to have a natural artistic talent specifically for drawing and visual art. This is presented with enough specificity and enough affection that it functions as more than a one-off joke. The show seemed to be suggesting, in those early seasons, that Chris had a gift, a genuine one, something that set him apart in the same way that Peter's social stupidity set Peter apart and Stewie's genius set Stewie apart. The artistic talent appears and then, like so many other things in this show, quietly fades from prominence. It is referenced occasionally in later seasons, but never developed into anything that genuinely changes our understanding of who Chris is or what his life might become. He remains fixed in his default configuration, the dim, sweet, slightly lost middle child without the artistic dimension ever being resolved into part of his actual identity. There is a genuinely interesting story buried in the mythology of Chris Griffin, a boy with artistic talent growing up in a household defined by chaos, cruelty, and the constant need to manage Peter Griffin's disasters. A boy who should, by the evidence the show has provided, have some path toward developing his natural gifts into something meaningful. A boy whose sweetness is frequently submerged beneath the general noise of his family's existence, but who resurfaces in quiet moments that the show has occasionally captured with genuine warmth. The show chose not to tell that story. It chose to keep Chris in the simplest version of himself, the one that required the least maintenance, the one that could be deployed for comedy without asking anyone in the writer's room to track where his character was in his own development. The mystery of Chris Griffin is the mystery of potential unrealized. Not through tragedy, not through some external force that prevented him from becoming what he might have been, but through simple inattention. The show had a character with genuine, interesting qualities and chose not to follow them to wherever they were going. He is, in this way, the most quietly melancholy of the Griffin children's stories. Stewie's story has drama, the transformation, the lost villain, the universe he accidentally made. Meg's story has sustained intensity, the abuse, the suffering, the moments of resilience, the injustice of all of it. Chris's story has neither drama nor intensity. It has absence. The quiet absence of a character the show built and then gently put down. Deep dive. The secondary characters who deserved more: Mort, Joe, and the rest of Quahog. The secondary cast of Family Guy is, in aggregate, one of the show's most underutilized resources. The town of Quahog is populated with characters who each had, at their introduction, a specific personality and specific comedic register that distinguished them from each other and from the Griffins. What happened to many of them over time is a version of the same story we have been telling all night: character concepts that were introduced, partially developed, and then left in whatever state they occupied when the show's attention moved on. Joe Swanson is the clearest example of a secondary character whose arc over the show's run constitutes a genuine tragedy if you track it carefully. When Joe was introduced in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he was the new neighbor, the guy everyone in the street immediately admired. He was a cop, athletic and capable, living with a disability that the show was careful, in that early episode, not to make the primary thing about him. He was cool. He was respected. Peter was actually jealous of how easily Joe commanded the admiration of the people around him. Over the following seasons, this version of Joe was gradually eroded. His disability became more frequently a punchline rather than a character detail. His marriage to Bonnie became increasingly unhappy, with Bonnie developing feelings of dissatisfaction and resentment toward Joe that the show eventually used to drive plot without ever fully developing the emotional logic of how and why their relationship deteriorated. His friendships with Peter, Quagmire, and Cleveland became more transactional and occasionally outright cruel, with Joe frequently on the receiving end of behavior from his supposed friends that no genuinely supportive friendship would involve. The mystery of Joe Swanson is the mystery of a character who began the show at a high point and spent the rest of it sliding. The man who everyone looked up to in Season 1 became, by the later seasons, a figure of recurrent diminishment. His wheelchair, which in the early episode was presented as one dimension of a complex and capable man, became increasingly the primary lens through which the show related to him as a source of jokes, as a limitation the show could invoke whenever it needed to make Joe seem small. This is not an accident. It is the same process that transformed Peter, Brian, and others, the slow reduction of complexity to a simple, manageable, easily deplorable comedic function. Joe was easy to make into a target of jokes because his disability provided the show with material it could reach for when it needed something quick. The fact that this involved treating a character who was initially presented with genuine dignity as a recurring punchline is the dark underside of the show's opportunistic approach to its own cast. Mort Goldman is another secondary character whose history with the show is worth examining. Mort began as a background presence, the pharmacist's neighbor, nervous and anxious, prone to disaster, married to Muriel, father to Neil, who had an unrequited fixation on Meg. He was a recurring figure in Quahog community scenes, reliable for specific kinds of jokes that drew on his particular combination of anxiety and mishap. After Muriel's death in And Then There Were Fewer, which, as we have established, stayed permanent, Mort continued to appear but without the show doing much with the fact of his loss. A man who had been married for decades, whose wife was killed at a dinner party he attended, who is now a widower with a teenage son. This is a character situation with genuine emotional weight. The show mostly did not apply that weight. Mort continued to serve his comedic function, his widower status occasionally acknowledged but rarely developed into something that changed how we understood him or how he moved through the world. The secondary characters of Quahog are, in aggregate, a portrait of the show's relationship with its own ensemble. Each of them was created with enough specificity to feel like a real person in the early seasons. Each of them has been through significant experiences that should, in a show that cared about its own mythology, have changed them in visible ways. Most of them have instead remained roughly where they started, deployed for whatever the current episode needs, without the show ever fully reckoning with who they have become across 25 years of extraordinary events. The mystery of the secondary characters is ultimately the same mystery as the main cast, compressed into less screen time. It is the mystery of what happens to people who the story keeps touching without fully committing to, who accumulate experiences and losses and changes that are noted and then filed away, who exist in the space between being fully realized and being purely functional. They are Quahog's hidden population, the people who lived through everything the show put them through and came out the other side still standing, still recognizable, still showing up at the town meetings and the community events and the drunken clam, carrying the weight of everything that happened and the strange lightness of a world that has chosen not to fully acknowledge it. Deep dive. What the show's music says about what it believes. Family Guy has always been a musically unusual show. Seth MacFarlane, who voices 4 of the main characters, is a genuine singer with a distinctive musical sensibility that he has applied to both the show and his separate recording career. The result is a show that has produced, across its run, an unusual number of genuinely skilled musical numbers, songs that are not just comedic interludes but actual pieces of music that function on their own terms. The musical numbers in Family Guy occupy a strange position in the show's mythology. They are often more honest than the dialogue. They frequently express things that the characters would not say in regular conversation, things that reveal what the characters actually feel or believe beneath the performance they put on for each other and for the audience. And they accumulate across 25 seasons into a kind of musical autobiography of the show's inner life. Peter's songs are usually comedic and broad, in line with his character built for laughs, not for revelation. But occasionally, a Peter musical number will land differently, will reveal a vulnerability or a longing that his regular behavior obscures. These moments are rare but noticeable when they occur. Brian's musical moments tend toward the melancholy. He has produced songs across the show's run that touch on his failures, his loneliness, his complicated relationship with his own potential. The musical version of Brian has always been slightly more honest than the conversational version, more willing to acknowledge pain, more able to express the gap between what he hoped his life would be and what it actually is. The Road to musical numbers are their own category, as we discussed, and deserve to be recognized as some of the show's most emotionally ambitious work. Songs like You've Got a Lot to See from Road to Rhode Island, which Brian and Stewie perform to express the discovery of genuine friendship amid an unexpected adventure, operate at a register that the show's regular dialogue can rarely reach. The song says something true about what it feels like to be genuinely seen by another person, about the specific kind of discovery that real friendship involves, and it says it in a way that the show's comedic register could not accommodate. The mystery of the music in Family Guy is the mystery of what the show keeps in reserve, what it saves for the musical moments, because those moments create permission for honesty that the regular narrative does not. When the show wants to say something true about its characters' interior lives, it often reaches for a song. When it wants to say something true about loss, or about friendship, or about the gap between aspiration and reality, the musical number is sometimes the only vehicle that carries enough emotional freight. This suggests that the show knows more than it says, that underneath the surface of an irreverent animated comedy, there is a sensibility that understands what genuine feeling looks like and can produce it on command when the context allows. The music is the evidence. The mystery is why that sensibility stays confined to the musical moments, or to the rare experimental episodes like Brian and Stewie in the Vault. Why the knowledge of what genuine emotional honesty looks like, which clearly lives somewhere in the show's creative center, does not more consistently shape the work as a whole. The answer is probably that honesty is hard to sustain and easier to perform. A song that acknowledges loss or longing or the gap between who you are and who you wanted to be is a contained, manageable moment of honesty. You perform it, and then you step back into the show's usual register and everyone moves on. The sustained work of building characters who are genuinely honest across an entire series run, that is something different, something harder, something the show has approached and backed away from many times. The music knows. The music has always known. It is the show's most honest voice, the one it brings out when it needs to say something it cannot otherwise find the words for. We are at the end of tonight's journey. Thank you for every minute of it. Subscribe, comment, share, and sleep well. See you in the next one. The Last Door. A final note on what mysteries are for. There is one more thing worth saying before we close the door on tonight's exploration, and it is something simple. Something that all the mysteries we have discussed point toward, even if they never quite say it directly. Mysteries are not just about the things we do not know. They are about the things we care about enough to keep asking questions about long after the story that raised those questions has moved on. You do not wonder about things that do not matter to you. You do not revisit questions from stories that left no impression. The fact that people have been asking about Stan Thompson for more than 20 years, that discussions about Brian's character still reference the bank vault as a defining moment, that arguments about what happened to Stewie and who he became still draw in people who watched the show as children and are now adults. All of this is evidence of something. These characters mattered. This show, in its best moments, produced something that lodged in people, something that has weight and strangeness and genuine feeling. The mysteries it left open are open because the audience cared enough to notice the doors and kept caring about what was on the other side even when the show stopped paying attention. That is the strangest and most honest thing you can say about Family Guy. A show that spent years being louder than it needed to be and lazier than it could have been, that often treated its own best impulses as inconveniences and its audience's emotional investment as something to exploit rather than honor. That show somehow also built something worth caring about. The mysteries are proof. They are the residue of genuine investment on the part of the writers who planted them and on the part of the audience who noticed them and kept asking. They are evidence of what happens when something is made with enough care, even imperfect and inconsistent care, that it leaves a mark. The doors are still open, the cold air is still coming through, and the show is still on.